Excellent. Good morning, everyone. My name is Julian Ennis. I'm a utilities engineer with the Grid Resiliency and Microgrids team, and we are here today, November 8th, 2023, for the Resiliency Standards workshop on methodologies, specifically about improving resilience in the integrated resource planning process. And our presenters today will be Lumen Energy Strategies. Next slide, please. So just a few informational things about this meeting. Here you can see the WebEx and call-in information. You can use the link to join by computer, and we do recommend you join by computer so you can see the slides that are being shared and have the ability to see the Q&A as well. You can also join by phone with the numbers shown here and the access code here. Just a few notes. Today's presentations will be available in the meeting invite if you follow the link above, and will also be available shortly after on the Resiliency and Microgrids website linked here. Just as a note, the entirety of this meeting, including the Q&A sessions, will be recorded, and the recording will be posted for everyone's reference at the same website. In a few days once we have been able to parse the recording and upload it to YouTube. And also just as a note that while one or more commissioners and their staff may be present, no decisions will be made at this meeting. Next slide, please. A few WebEx logistics before we get started. All attendees are muted on entry by default. During our Q&A periods, you can ask your questions in one of two ways. The first way is you can raise your hand. Within the WebEx panel, you can click on the hand button next to your name. It will show me a raised hand, and we will go ahead and unmute you in order for you to ask your question and have it answered verbally by one of our panelists. We do ask that you keep your question to 2 minutes or under, although we will allow follow-up time permitting during those sessions. If you have another question after your first question, please go ahead and lower your hand and then re-raise your hand. It helps me prioritize the questions in the order that they come in. For those calling in on their phone, if you wish to raise your hand, you need to click *6, and that will show me that your hand is raised, and I will send you a request to unmute. You can also ask questions in written form using the Q&A box. If you go down to the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little box with a question mark in it that you can click that will allow you to post a written question, which will either be answered by one of our panelists through the Q&A function or will be read out loud during one of the Q&A sessions and can be answered verbally thereafter. Also, just as a note, closed captioning can be turned on in this meeting by going to the bottom left-hand corner and clicking on the small button that says CC. We found that the WebEx closed captioning is pretty good, although a little bit delayed. So, but it's a fantastic feature, and it will be also available in the recording that we make of today's workshop. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Roseanne. Roseanne, go ahead.
Hi. Thank you so much. My name is Roseanne Mitkevich. I'm a senior analyst on the Grid Resiliency and Microgrids team. And Energy staff has been conducting workshops aimed at diving deeper into some of the more complex aspects of this differentiation and how to apply it to policy. In May, Lumen Energy Strategies led the first of 3 sessions looking at resiliency standards, definitions, followed by their workshop in September as a deep dive into how we could use resiliency metrics for resiliency decision-making. Today, we'll continue that conversation looking at methodologies to apply resiliency considerations into the bulk grid planning process, focused on the integrated resource portfolio process and using the guiding principles of the 4-pillar methodology. On our agenda today, after our introduction here, I will turn it over to Commissioner Shiroma for opening remarks. I will then lead us through a quick review of the resiliency work that we've accomplished to date and how that leads into our workshop today. Our IRP staff, Sarah Goldmunds, will review the current integrated resource planning process, and then we'll turn it over to Lumen for their work and presentation on the resiliency standards and how electric resiliency planning can be used as a methodology in the IRP process, or could. And I will turn it over to, and then we'll have closing remarks. Actually, I think Commissioner Shiroma may not be able to do closing remarks today, but then we will let you know what upcoming workshops are happening after that. I'll now turn it over to Commissioner Shiroma.
Thank you, Roseanne. Good morning, everyone. My name is Genevieve Shiroma. My pronouns are she, her. Welcome to today's webinar discussing opportunities for local authorities, community leaders, load-serving entities, and state regulators to integrate energy resiliency into the broader grid planning with a focus on the California Public Utilities Commission's Integrated Resource Planning, or IRP, process. I'm the lead commissioner for the CPUC's microgrid proceeding, and in that capacity, I've had the opportunity to work with this team on our overall efforts to improve energy resiliency for Californians. This is the 8th workshop in this series. As Roseanne has outlined, it's been a very public-facing and intensive effort. The Commission has worked with stakeholders and experts to develop new metrics and standards for measuring resiliency initiatives, and in particular, the 4-pillar methodology that sets a baseline assessment for these existing situation, a mitigation measure assessment, a resiliency scorecard, and then a resiliency response assessment for investments. It's very, very practical. Today, the workshop will explore how these innovative tools can be, and practical tools, can be applied specifically to the Commission's integrated resource planning process, which helps the state plan cost-effective energy resource mixes that can keep us on track to meeting our ambitious clean energy targets. We'll also hear about incorporating local resiliency needs and system-wide climate risks into that IRP process using these tools. I believe that all of these resiliency tools and methodologies that we develop at the CPUC must be geared towards providing tangible benefits to diverse communities across the state. I look forward to learning today about how governments, load-serving entities, and others can utilize these tools in assuring that communities have a reliable source of energy in this era of climate change and growing wildfire threats. I want to thank the presenters from the Energy Division and Lumen Energy Strategies for speaking today about this very important topic. I do want to take this moment to thank our hardworking Energy Division staff for coordinating this informational session, and in particular, our Senior Regulatory Analyst, Roseanne Rekovich, Utilities Engineer, Julian Ennis, their Supervisor, Jason Ortego, Program Manager, Matt Caldwell, Deputy Director, Simon Baker, and Deputy Executive Director, Luam Tesfaye. And from my office, my Chief of Staff, Cheryl Wynn, and Advisor, Jack Chang. And as Roseanne indicated, due to my schedule today, I will need to leave at the break, which is scheduled for 11:10. My Chief of Staff, Cheryl Wynn, Advisor Jack Chang, will be listening to the entire workshop. And I do thank everyone for their attention and participation today. Back to you, Roseanne.
Thank you, Commissioner. So as background and context, next slide. We started this process off by asking the question, how can we optimize grid investments to integrate resiliency? In the face of some significant changes over the last few years, we know that more extreme disruptions are happening more frequently. Resiliency evaluation is different for those at opposite ends of the equity and wealth spectrum. We know that disruptions highlight the interdependencies of critical infrastructure systems, and at the same time, state decarbonization is critical to minimize climate change, but we need to increase confidence in electrification while still meeting our safety, reliability, and renewable portfolio goals. So the goal is to take this knowledge and translate it into a process that can ensure resiliency investments are balanced with reliability and to protect our most vulnerable while still being affordable. Next slide, please. Part of that process is to understand how a system functions and responds over time to a disruption and how resiliency in the system affects that system function response. This resiliency trapezoid, which we've showed several times, but I want to highlight it again here, shows how the mechanisms of improving resilience can be described as reducing the magnitude of disruption, which is number 1 on this, the distance between the top line and where it drops, the magnitude of the disruption, extending the duration of resistance, which is number 2, that short distance between where it drops and where it starts to find some level of stabilization, and where reduce the duration of the disruption, which is that long bottom of the floor of the trapezoid, and reduce the duration of the recovery, which is that curved line coming up, which is always somewhat variable. So the goal becomes how to find ways to measure the difference between the baseline case, the floor of the trapezoid when it drops towards the x-axis, which would be how we are responding now in our present moment, and the improvements represented by the dotted line. So if we introduce improvements, how well have we done during the next disruption? The chart on the left are examples of the kind of system functions we could potentially trace to understand if we're making an impact on improving resilience. Coincidentally, we could chart these system functions as relative to each other by way of the common x-axis of time in order to gain an understanding of the system function interrelatedness and whether our improvement of resilience in one system is impacting the other or another. Next slide, please. The resiliency trapezoid is an oversimplified graphic depiction of a complex measurement of response to a system function disruption. But we've used the resiliency trapezoid concept to guide how to think about resiliency assessment in our current system and how to assess whether investment decisions have improved resiliency. We recognize that resiliency means different things to different communities and organizations at different scales. Geography and the hazards that cause disruptions vary greatly. Communities have different levels of resources at hand to address local resilience priorities, making local coordination important to the process. Changing technologies available cause changes in system resiliency. Measuring the changes in resiliency becomes relative to geography, community priorities, likelihood and frequency of types of disruptions, as well as to the other goals like clean energy, affordability, and daily operations. So to take these complexities into consideration, we've suggested a holistic resiliency evaluation and planning approach that provides a scalable, sequential, and iterative process by which resiliency can be assessed, mitigation measures can be compared and optimized, resiliency responses can be assessed for effectiveness, and resiliency efforts can be incrementally improved with each iteration. As a scalable methodology, it could be applied to a specific small application like a single customer solution, a multi-property solution, or as large as a regional bulk grid planning assessment of mitigation strategies. Each of these pillars is worthy of a deeper discussion, and in the working group meetings a couple of years ago, 2 years ago in 2021, we explored each pillar in depth, working with stakeholders to validate this approach to resiliency planning. The details within each of these pillars provide a method to address the myriad aspects of resiliency we just talked about. In a quick review, baseline assessment covers what do we want to protect and where is it? That's number 1, 2, and 3 under baseline assessment. What threatens it? That's number 4 and 5. How well are we doing now to protect it? Now, that's number 6. So baseline assessment is our current assessment as it is right now. Pillar 2, mitigation measure assessment, looks at what protection options do we have. That's number 1. What does the best job at protecting the most? That's number 2. And what does it cost? Number 3. And how do we compare mitigation measure costs as they apply to the hazards that are affecting our geographical area that we're looking at. The resiliency scorecard, pillar 3, is a way to score resiliency configuration characteristics that reflect benchmarks of resiliency achievement and includes characteristics that support clean energy goals, local community resiliency goals, and the ability to provide daily operational services. We're not tying the scorecard to any compensatory or evaluation outcomes. This tool right now is intended to be a preferential metric that reflects weighting towards state policy goals and resiliency goals with a relationship to identified resilience targets that are user defined. So we're thinking of this as a comparative tool of resiliency configurations, and this is still in development, this piece. Pillar 4 is the resiliency response assessment. This represents the iterative nature of the methodology. This is where we use our metrics to answer how well did the investments do in reaching resiliency targets. So evaluating our investments several years later, taking into account any disruptive events that have happened within that time, looking at did the investments reduce the impacts on the community. Next slide, please. Energy Division staff has been conducting workshops aimed at diving deeper into some of the more complex aspects of the 4-pillar methodological approach and how to move it from concept to application. Within these meetings, we included external partner presentations that provided insight and discussion opportunities about tools such as the Interruption Cost Estimate Calculator, the POET, the Power Outage Economic Tool, and the Resiliency Node Cluster Analysis Tool, RENCAT, that could be used as potential metrics in implementation of both baseline and mitigation measure assessments within this methodology. We discussed the feasibility of how to gain greater coordination between local authorities and the utilities by using local hazard mitigation plans and locally determined resilience targets, an important concept across all 4 pillars. And in the last workshop, we saw demonstrations of how to apply the 4-pillar methodology to resilience planning at the small utility microgrid scale and the medium campus-wide scale. Today's presentation highlights the integration of many of these concepts into our continued discussion of how standard definitions of resiliency and specific resilience metrics can be applied at the grid planning process scale, focusing on integrated resource planning, or IRP, as the use case. In this presentation, Lumen Energy Strategies will discuss how resiliency priorities could be discussed and coordinated between local jurisdictions and load-serving entities, or LSEs, and how these resources could provide both local resiliency and IRP-level grid resiliency resources. Lumen will also discuss how these resource owners and LSEs could structure portfolios in a way that clearly defines resilience and operational responsibilities, as well as the residual energy capacity that could be provided to the grid. This could help optimize the balances and trade-offs between blue sky and black sky obligations and potentially reduce costs for both LSEs and asset owners. I'll turn it now over to Sarah Goldmunds, who will provide a brief overview of our current IRP process.
Thanks for the introduction, Roseanne. And yeah, my name is Sarah Goldmunds. I'm a senior analyst on the Integrated Resource Planning, or IRP team. Today, I'll cover some IRP background, where we are in our current IRP cycle, our LSC filing requirements that are sort of the bedrock of the IRP process, and I'll also provide some general insights about what our LSC submitted as a part of this IRP cycle. So to start us off, IRP is written in statute in Senate Bill, or SB 350. From the IRP staff side, we see the 2 major goals of SB 350, and we're of the opinion that these 2 goals both drive the process and the timing for an IRP cycle. These are generally dictated by the 2 first bolded items that you see here. The first is identifying a diverse and balanced portfolio of resources that provides optimal integration of renewable energy in a cost-effective manner. That sort of dictates the first part of the cycle, which I'll cover shortly. The second part is adopting a process by which LSEs file an IRP that ensured that they meet a number of different goals, which are listed below here. I think of particular note for the microgrid community is what I have bolded here, which is the diversity, sustainability, and resilience of the bulk transmission and distribution systems, as well as local communities. Though I do note that LSCs have a range of other goals that they have to meet as a part of the IRP process. On the next slide, regarding the objectives of IRP today, we think of IRP generally within our team as the process that gets us from point A to point B. As we see it, the IRP process allows us to see across the state's 40 plus individual load serving entities, or LSEs, to identify solutions to reliability and cost that might not otherwise be apparent when looking at one individual LSE's portfolio. The current IRP cycle that we're in, the 2022-2023 IRP cycle, is geared at ensuring that the state's electricity sector is on track, both from a GHG and reduction perspective and a reliability perspective between now and 2035, while also making sure that the state can meet SB 100's 100% renewable and carbon-free electricity requirement by 2045. Broadly, the IRP process aims to achieve these things through two main processes as we see it defined in statute, which I'll cover in depth shortly. But generally, the first part of this process identifies an optimal portfolio for meeting state policy objectives and encourages LSEs to procure to that future. We'll cover that pretty in depth with the filing requirements. The second part of this that we see is that the IRP process requires that all LSCs submit their IRPs to show that they are individually aiming to meet those collective goals. From there, the IRP team collects and aggregates each individual LSC's joint efforts to meet the goals. And through modeling processes, we adopt what we consider the marquee item of an IRP cycle, which is our preferred system plan, or a PSP. The PSP details the state's preferred mix of resources to meet state goals. Before we go any further, though, and on the next slide, I did want to provide some background definitions that if you're not maybe familiar with the IRP process, these may be new to you. And for those of you who are familiar with the IRP process, these are probably a review, but important to go over. We have two models in use in the IRP process. The first is our resolve model. It's a capacity expansion model that identifies optimal long-term electric generation and transmission investments. Within that, we can put in different constraints within the model. Let's say if there's a policy goal, SB 100 would be one of those, to sort of make sure that we're getting an accurate representation of what the state is aiming to achieve. For more information on the resolve model, I would direct stakeholders and others to visit the CPUC's website for our recently released 2023 Inputs and Assumption, or INA document. You can see all of the constraints within the model and different functions that we use within our modeling efforts. The second model that we use is called SERVM. It's a production cost model, or PCM. We generally take the portfolios from Resolve and do additional analysis on these portfolios to see how reliable they are, and GHG and other factors. Both of these models are integral to the IRP process, and we work quite a bit with our energy resource modeling team, or ERM, here at the CPUC, as well as consultants E3, to make sure that the portfolios that we're using for the PSP reflect best modeling. The other two things that I want to cover are just some definitions about resources on the modeling side. So the first are candidate resources. So within the resolve process, our resolve model can choose what are called candidate resources. Candidate resources are probably the ones that folks are most familiar with, and are those that are commercially viable resources, ones that are sort of readily available and can include things such as solar and lithium ion batteries, but also geothermal, wind, pumped hydro storage. That's not to say that our modeling and IRP doesn't consider things like emerging tech, but just to say that these aren't the candidate resources. We do evaluate emerging tech and other such resources. And again, I would direct folks to our inputs and assumption to see the breakdown of resources and how we consider non-candidate resources. And then lastly, we have our baseline resources. Baseline resources are the resources that are currently online and operational, or ones that LSEs have contracted with and have a contract that has been approved by the LSE's highest decision-making authority within the planning horizon. So again, that's not to say that we don't consider resources that LSEs may or may not have under contract or be planning to contract. But in terms of our baseline list of resources, it's limited to the online resources and the ones that we see as very materially coming on in the near future. We can go to the next slide. Now that we have a little bit of background, I just want to provide an overview of what a typical IRP planning cycle looks like, which is around 2 or 3 years. So the first step is the sort of like, what do we want our LSEs? What future do we want to plan to? And through that, we set our filing requirements. We work close in hand with other state agencies, particularly CARB, on things like the GHG target. And we set the standards that we then, in step 2, have the LSEs tell us how they're planning to meet that future. As any of the LSEs will tell you, and anyone that's worked on the IRP, the second step of this requires quite a bit of work on the LSE side to submit a host of documents, which I will go through shortly. We're currently in this step 3, which is creating our preferred system plan, or PSP. On October 5th of this year, IRP's ALJ issued our proposed PSP ruling, which put forward our proposed preferred system plan. This is very much a live process right now, as comments are due on the ruling this coming Monday, just after the holiday, with reply comments due shortly thereafter on December 1st. We're working towards the February 15th CPUC voting meeting. We're hopefully looking to adopt a preferred system plan, and that will take us to step 4, which is where the PSP is adopted. That PSP portfolio we then transmit to the CAISO, the California Independent System Operator, which they use the adopted plan as part of their transmission planning process. I'll note that the CPUC does have jurisdiction to order procurement based on the PSP cycle, but to date, we haven't done that. If we go to the next slide, I mentioned the TPP, or the transmission planning process, as one of the natural junctures where the PSP is used, and that is the basis of the CAISO's transmission planning process. But the adopted PSP is used in other, both internal CPUC avenues and then also externally. So in the last cycle, so in the 2019-2021 IRP cycle, we use the adopted PSP portfolio to set the filing requirements for the current cycle that we're in right now. And generally, we expect that to be the case for the next cycle, which, believe it or not, we're already gearing up for. I already mentioned the TPP, but the adopted PSP is also likely to be used as the basis for the 2024 ACC, or Avoided Cost Calculator update. The ACC then will probably flow into things like NEM, so the PSP will show up there. And then also within the CPUC, the adopted PSP portfolio will be used as the basis for gas forecast in proceedings like the ELISO proceeding. And then taking a step back just beyond what we do here at the CPUC, the SB 100 analysis that's currently underway will incorporate the adopted PSP portfolio and likely build on that. So just a general sense that the PSP is not just solely for planning in IRP, but has applicability elsewhere. And now that I've covered some of the kind of basic IRP 101, I do want to go more in depth about the LSE filing requirements and how we at the CPUC on the IRP team analyze what the LSEs submit. So broadly speaking, the IRP cycle really took off in earnest after the CPUC issued our filing requirements and after the LSEs submitted their individual IRPs on November 1st, 2022. The plans really at their most basic level are how LSEs tell us at the Commission how they plan to procure to meet their assigned GHG and reliability targets, as well as meeting other requirements that they may have, like their Renewables Portfolio Standard, or RPS requirements. LSEs also report on other priorities in their plan, such as how they plan to pursue the activities within their procurement plans, how they're going to conduct outreach to disadvantaged communities or DACs, and other facets. For example, LSEs this time reported on how they were procuring long duration energy storage and how they were planning for a high electrification future. These filings are the vehicle by which both the CPUC and stakeholders gain insight into the preference of different LSEs to meet a singular state goal. If you go to the next slide, we see the 3 components as filing requirements as such. The narrative template, which is used for LSEs to provide a qualitative description, things like the disadvantaged communities outreach that I mentioned earlier, and other more qualitative aspects of their procurement plans. So the narrative template covers that. The resource data template, or the RDT, is what LSEs use to tell us about the individual contracts that they are submitting as part of their IRP plans. We get a lot of information about the operational characteristics of a resource that's under contract to give an LSE, and that forms the basis of the aggregated LSE portfolios that I'll go over shortly. And then the third filing requirement right now is the CSP, or the Clean System Power Calculator. LSEs use this to estimate their GHG and criteria pollutants of their submitted portfolios, and also use it to verify that they are meeting their GHG planning benchmarks. We go to the next slide. The two that I'll go into in more depth are the narrative templates and the RDTs, because that's probably of most interest to this group. So first, on the narrative templates and just generally cross-filing requirements, all LSEs are required to file both of these. On the narrative templates, LSEs can't opt out of portions of it. They're required to provide all requested information within the narrative template. LSEs that fail to do that will be contacted by CPUC staff to resubmit it, and continual failure to submit the narrative templates could mean an LSE could be subject to the IRP citation program. Once we have the narrative templates, IRP staff evaluate the narrative template selection against a standardized scorecard system, and there are 3 different ratings that an LSE can get for each section: exemplary, adequate, and deficient. Exemplary and adequate mean the LSE is good to go. LSEs with deficient scores will be required to formally file supplemental narrative template information to try and rectify those scores. That will be part of that information will be released as a part of our proposed decision for this PSP cycle. So that's an overview of the narrative templates. On the next slide, I'll also go over what our RDT, or resource data templates, collect. These templates are evaluated once we get the contracts from all the LSEs with a standardized RDT. These templates are evaluated by CPUC staff for completeness and internal consistency to ensure that they are accurately reflecting what LSEs are planning to do. We use an RDT error checking aggregation and reallocation tool, or RECART, to aggregate, error check, and analyze RDT filings. This requires an iterative process with LSEs who may have errors in their RDT, and we work with LSEs to ensure that the data that they are submitting is high quality and as error-free as possible. It's also worth noting that IRP staff coordinate with the CEC on data for the publicly owned utilities, or POUs. We use this information to get a richer resource picture of what's going on throughout the CAISO BAA, including about LSEs that are not CPUC jurisdictionals. On the next slide, I'll go over a little bit of what the aggregation process looks like. So after we've gone through RECART and worked with the LSEs, and we have individual LSE templates that are accurate, again, to the extent possible, we then aggregate all LSE plans and evaluate the sum of these plans against overall electric system needs. The aggregated LSE plans are evaluated both against the reliability and GHG constraints, while seeking to meet these constraints at the lowest and reasonable cost to the state's ratepayers. CPUC staff can also identify if there are any planning gaps based on these LSE plans that may require action by the Commission to address. The next slide kind of shows what the results of those aggregations are. And I'll just note that here, LSEs were required to submit plans for both a 25 million metric ton, or 25 MMT target, as well as a 30 MMT target. For this audience, I've just included the 25 MMT plans. First, the 25 MMT plans represent the base of what was in the proposed ruling for the PSP portfolio. Second, though, if folks are interested in the 30 MMT plans, the CPUC's IRP website on the 2022-2023 cycle does have a lot more information about the aggregations for the 30 MMT plans, and I would direct you to looking there if you're interested. The other thing I'll note is that this is not the preferred system plan build out. This is the LSE aggregation build out. So the PSP portfolio is slightly different in that it includes sort of a top off of what the system might need to build on top of what LSEs are planning to meet the reliability and GHG targets. That proposed system plan is available in the ruling. And again, there's quite a bit more information on the CPUC's IRP site if folks are interested in more of the IRP side of this. So again, this is the 25 aggregated LSE plans at the 25 MMT target. These data are all publicly available and can be accessed on the CPUC's IRP page, which I know I've mentioned a lot, but we did just release quite a bit of information related to this. Just briefly, the trends that we're seeing in this build out are largely consistent with what staff might have expected. Within the IRP proceeding, we currently have 3 procurement decisions that required LSEs to procure a specific amount of NQC, or net qualifying capacity. In this chart specifically, we expect that 2 of those procurement decisions are reflected, and those are known as the MTR, or midterm reliability decision. The midterm reliability decisions we largely think are going to be filled by storage and solar plus storage, and the results from the LSE aggregations hint that that is what LSEs are doing. So again, that's consistent with the procurement directives currently active within this IRP proceeding. You'll note here, and probably of interest to this group, that these aggregations do not include many distributed energy resources. That's not to say that LSEs aren't procuring them. Again, these plans are from November 2022, so there's been procurement that's happened since then. And also just noting that on the post-aggregation side in our modeling, we do model DERs as demand modifiers, and all of that is explained in the inputs and assumptions document. More broadly on where we are here, it's worth noting that LSE submitted plans collectively to meet their 18.6 million metric ton and 15 million metric ton in 2020 and 2035 respectively, which is different than the targets that I mentioned earlier, but does represent just the CPUC jurisdictional share of the statewide 30 MMT target by 2030 and 25 MMT target by 2035. All of the LSCs met these targets with their plans and collectively showed intentions to exceed their proportional GHG requirements in their aggregations. Noting back to an earlier point, we use the CSP to evaluate this on an individual LSE basis. Here on the 25 MMT portfolios too, we note that the 25 MMT portfolios reduced GHG emissions by around 3 million metric tons below their GHG emission targets. For the purposes of this workshop, on the next slide too, IRP staff also analyzed just a few of the narrative templates on what LSEs were saying for resilience. I'll just note, first of all, this is not comprehensive. As I mentioned, we have 40 plus LSEs, all of whom serve vastly different populations and are addressing resilience likely in very different ways. So I don't put these on here to be exhaustive or to pick LSEs. They were more sort of indicative of geographic diversity to some extent and LSE type, and then also just LSEs that I maybe have more familiarity with because of compliance reviews. So again, if folks are interested in what other LSEs are doing, there are publicly available narrative templates on the CPUC docket, and you can browse through the narrative templates. I also won't go into the specifics of each of these programs. The LSEs could probably tell you quite a bit more than I could, but these 4 LSEs did show a wide range of how they are interpreting resiliency and what they are doing on the local side, whether that's providing energy storage systems to folks living in disadvantaged communities or DACs, or in high fire risk zones, as we see here in SCE, increasing and including EV charging, especially when grid conditions are less than ideal, as part of their resiliency strategy. We saw that with East Bay and Pacific Gas and Electric. And then MCE notes that they are using funds to update critical facilities to make sure that they are available during unplanned outages. So again, all of these are different approaches to a same sort of through line of resiliency within a local community. And now I'll just end with some general conclusions on the next slide. This slide does mention the 30 MMT portfolio. So again, if you're interested in that, all of that information is available within the IRP proceeding. But I'll just reiterate that all of the CPUC jurisdictional LSEs met their filing requirements. And sort of nicely for IRP staff, we did have to request fewer resubmissions of the RDT in this cycle than in previous cycles. We own this to one, LSCs being way more familiar with our filing requirements. This isn't the first cycle where they've been in place. So we view it as LSCs being more comfortable and familiar with the RDT and other filing requirements. As I mentioned, all CPUC jurisdictionals were assigned both a reliability filing requirement and a greenhouse gas reduction filing requirement. And across the board for both reliability and GHG, LSCs met, and some of them even surpassed those standards. So compliance there for all LSCs. I'll note one thing here for anyone here who may have followed previous IRP cycles. You may note that the LSC aggregation portfolio was slightly smaller in this round than what we've submitted in the past. I would say one, IRP staff don't view this as an issue by any means. Two, there's more information on this in the IRP proceeding where we sort of discuss some of the reasons for this. But broadly, I will say part of this size differential is due to LSCs opting for higher capacity factor resources, such as battery storage. As I mentioned, these are the resources that LSCs are procuring to meet their midterm reliability requirements. So they may procure a smaller nameplate size resource that offers them a higher NQC. And then back to my discussion about baseline resources, some of the resources that LSCs reported in the last cycle have now become part of the baseline and thus would not have been included in the aggregation, but are still part of the energy mix. And then lastly, just on the narrative templates, to preview what's going on in the IRP world, beyond the ruling being out and comments coming in, the LSC's narrative template scorecards will likely be included and released as a part of the proposed decision, which will be released in time to get to that February 15th commission voting meeting. And with that, I'm happy to take questions and turn it back over to Roseanne too.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. I'll be dealing with the Q&A. So just real quick for folks, as a reminder, you can submit questions in the written Q&A, or you can raise your hand. If you do raise your hand and we unmute you, please just remember to state your name and your affiliation at the top of your question, just so we know who you are. I don't see any hands raised at the moment. However, we do have a couple of questions in the written Q&A that perhaps I can read out loud and have you answer, Sarah. So this from Claire Broom, who asks, how will current IRP incorporate front-of-meter distribution grid solar and storage? And what about load shift demand flexibility, not just load shed?
Claire, this may be a not wholly satisfying answer, but I would direct you to our inputs and assumption document because it's one, a pretty involved process, and two, our consultants and our energy resource modeling team put quite a bit of effort into describing sort of how we're modeling all resources. So I'm happy to drop that in the Q&A, but yeah, I would direct you there. And if you have questions after that, I'm happy to follow up via email.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I also have Jaren from Tuolumne, California, who asks, do GHG emissions include from LSE-caused wildfire?
No, the GHG emissions are going to be based on the LSE submitted portfolios and not from LSE-caused wildfires.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So I don't see any more in the written Q&A. Perhaps we'll give folks just a moment to, oh, wait. Here we go. Jaren from Tuolumne actually also asks, how can local governments, say county governments, utilize this process for positive change, particularly in regards to resiliency and shutoffs?
I may punt and say that this could largely be answered by Lumen's presentation, or I think maybe that's the goal. Yeah, I guess there are a few other ways too that I could think of maybe off the top of my head. If you think of a local community that has a specific resource need, like I could kind of foresee them working with their utility about what they might want to procure. But I would say, like on the IRP side, the resources that we're seeing are not necessarily like how we're aggregating and looking at them isn't based on what a county government might say, but is what the utility is reporting to us. But I think the Lumen team may highlight ways in which that process could be altered.
Great, thank you, Sarah.
I think it's a wonderful lead-in.
That it definitely is. I do not see any raised hands nor any more questions in the Q&A. Again, for folks online, please feel free to submit your written questions through Q&A or raise your hands in the next comment period. Perhaps if there are residual questions from that, we can circle back to it. But Roseanne, perhaps we should move on and get into Lumen's presentation.
Wonderful. Claire and Jaren, thank you for your questions. And so through our Lumen presentation, we'll try to get at the questions and concerns that you have, but very interested to hear what you think, hear what your reactions are. So thank you, Sarah, for that introduction to IRP, and a big thank you to our CPUC hosts, Roseanne, Julian, Jason, Commissioner Sharoma, and others who enabled this meeting today. To everyone in the audience, thank you again for being here. We really look forward to your comments and questions throughout the presentation. So what is Lumen trying to do with this IRP case study? We are conducting an EPIC-funded study called Warp to Resilience, and our mission really is to advance climate resilience in resource planning, and as part of that, break through institutional barriers to planning for resilience. And I think it might be fair to say that all of us are trying to do that here, so that's what makes this meeting extra exciting for us. Owner and I each have almost 20 years of experience in resource planning, including actually building and running nodal production cost models and building and running capacity expansion models. So we do understand the trade-offs of those models. We understand why they're built the way they are. And now we're looking at those models from a different angle. And just to be clear, not to tear down them. They are built the way they are for a good reason. But to see where there's room to bring in more information for resilience planning and how we can expand our toolkit in resource planning. So we'll talk about methodologies for doing that. Our presentation is organized into 3 parts. The first is a recap of our resilience metrics and stakeholder feedback from prior presentations. The second is discussion of methodology for local resilience planning, including grid benefits. And Claire and Jaren, I think that's where addressing your questions starts. And then the third is methodology for incorporating local resilience needs and system-wide climate risks into the broader IRP forum. But I usually like to start with a little bit of a better understanding of who's in our audience. So I find that helpful. And we have a poll question for you. The question is, what stakeholder perspective best describes you? So to respond to this poll, please open your browser, go to pollev.com/lumen999. Again, that's pollev.com/lumen999. If you're on your phone and you don't have a web browser, you can also text Lumen 999 to the number 22333 and follow the prompts. I recommend using the browser if you can. It's much easier that way, and you can see results pop up on the screen too. So pick the one that best describes you, and you can see the results either on your browser screen or here on the presentation. You can also edit your response. There is an undo button on the right of your response, so you can click on that if you change your mind. And when you're done, stay on this browser page because we'll have a few more polls sprinkled through our middle section, and then they'll pop up in the same spot on your browser when activated. And just to be clear, all of our poll responses are anonymous. So all the polling questions, including we have a word cloud later on, that's all anonymous. So please do respond if you're so inclined. So we've still got some responses coming in. Looks like we have a lot of utility and load serving entity representatives, which is great. A lot of regulators, policymakers, and sort of a sprinkling of one person from ISO RTO, customer representatives, some subject matter experts, researchers or academics, and other. So thank you for your responses. I'm going to close this poll now. Again, stay on that browser page because we'll have a couple more polls for you later on. And then in the final presentation, we always copy the results of these polls into the final presentation. So look for that if any of the polls are interesting to you and you want to look back on them, they will be available. Okay, closing the poll now. So in our September information session, we had a couple of polls like that, plus 2 more in-depth audience brainstorming exercises. And I want to be clear that all of your feedback in these meetings, including polls, the audience exercises, the Q&A, that's all taken very seriously, and it generates a lot of discussion in our study team. And sometimes it even leads to us refining or rerouting our efforts so that we can be more useful to you. So in our prior presentation, you gave us feedback on customer and outage characteristics of most concern, and as part of that, the underlying hazards of concern. And this is all part of our interpretation of the Pillar 1 baseline assessment and us trying to get at the different levels of that. So most people agreed that the key resilience hazards at the state grid planning level are weather or environmental variabilities, trends, and extremes. But concerns over physical security, cybersecurity, and other non-weather related disasters were also raised. These types of resilience hazards, they're not going to be part of the model we're building right now. We're focused more on climate and weather resilience, but they are important from a broader planning perspective. So I want to acknowledge that and make sure we don't let it go. So in September, we asked you where physical and or cybersecurity considerations belong. Out of 14 audience responses, 2 people said that they should be part of IRP. 5 other people said, used words like integral or suggested it should be part of grid planning. And then 1 person noted that the utilities address physical and cybersecurity as an enterprise risk in rulemaking 20-07013. That's the CPUC's risk-based decision-making framework proceeding. We also asked about where planning for other non-weather disasters belongs. The responses were more varied on this one, and it took some time to interpret. So for example, 1 person said, resilience must plan for all types of disasters, which I agree with. Another said that these other disasters are impossible to plan for and said that it's unreasonable. And that also sounds right. And if you think about it, these 2 apparently opposite responses, they're both consistent with emergency planning and risk management of complex systems. So it is impossible to plan for every type of event. If planning means defining exactly what that event looks like, and especially on those highly improbable extremes that we don't have much experience with. But in a way, you can plan for them by assuming the system fails, and then address routes for system recovery and minimizing impact of system failure to people. So relatedly, several others mentioned microgrids, which I do see as a layer of system redundancy, assuming the macrogrid system fails. And overall, we interpreted these responses on planning for non-weather disasters as needing more of a emergency planning approach where you assume the system fails without trying to define exactly how or when, or without necessarily trying to define that. In September, we had an audience exercise where we presented 2 versions of resilience definition. One was more conceptual, and one was more focused on gauging resilience against a specific customer outage threshold. Again, we're still at Pillar 1, defining the problem. So building off of prior presentations, a CPUC concept paper on the topic, we drafted these definitions. They were just for discussion purposes, not a formal proposal to the CPUC, and we got some really good feedback. Most people saw the need for both types of definitions. Overall, people suggested that the conceptual definition does really well to capture the different dimensions of resilience. If you think of the resilience trapezoid, the need to prioritize specific customers. And then several people in that conceptual definition, they didn't like the words knowable or extreme. They found it too limiting. And then as we stared at it longer and upon further discussion, questions came up about how to interpret and translate some of these words into specific planning metrics. Moving to the bottom, more specific definition, people liked it because it's unambiguous and it's actionable. But there were questions about whether or not division level was the right geography, whether outage duration was the right metric. And in terms of major event days, outage metrics on major event days, that doesn't help with prioritizing for outage impacts to customers. And by outage impacts, I mean customers' ability to access essential services they need in the event of an outage. Major event days, that also doesn't address that we have to meet essential needs on an everyday basis. But I do personally like this focus on major event days because it's a statistical definition and it allows you to, over time, adjust where you consider what you consider in terms of reliability planning versus resilience planning in an internally consistent way. And that's something that we have to think about too. So that's just a quick overview of the feedback we received. If you weren't in the September presentation and you had any other thoughts on resilience definitions, I encourage you to reach out to Roseanne and Julian and send them your thoughts. And then finally in September, we had a longer audience exercise to explore. When you have outage and customer data right in front of you, how do you identify resilience planning priorities? And this was the presentation's main focus. We looked at outage data and customer characteristics for 2 adjacent communities, Sonora and Twain Harte. This is us starting to step into pillars 2 and 3. We explored what are the main concerns, what are the resource attributes needed to address those concerns. Many people in the audience in these exercises said that longer duration outages, that's the biggest concern. Frequency could also be a problem, but I think the longer duration outages were the biggest concern. And then we found that prioritization amongst customers, that's not always clear how to do that. Customers may already have some amount of mitigations in place, and that adds another dimension that makes the decision-making very difficult. So resource solutions, they're going to be highly dependent on the community characteristics and on the specific infrastructure of that community. That's something we discussed in that exercise. So there's no universal fix. Even if your priorities are the same, there's no universal fix for every community. And that's where we landed with that. So now that brings us to the second part of our presentation, recognizing that we have this understanding that local communities or even the neighborhood level perspective, that's essential to effective resilience planning. So how do we connect local resilience planning with IRP level planning? And first I'll start with clarifying some terms. So when I say local authorities, I'm referring to cities, counties, tribal entities, community-based organizations, and other community leaders and decision makers. Load-serving entities or LSEs, that includes investor-owned utilities, the IOUs, community choice aggregators, CCAs, and competitive electric service providers, ESPs. And then when we talk about resources and grid domains, terminologies can be really different depending on your subject expertise. Like Claire, for example, when you said front of meter can mean different things to different people, but you did clarify distribution connected, I believe. So we try to define based on grid domain the resources it is interconnected to. And we believe that's important for interconnection, for procurement, for market participation. So we try to use the terms customer sited, distribution connected, and transmission connected whenever we can. You also hear us use terms like bulk grid resources, which refers mostly to transmission connected resources, but really it's a wholesale market perspective. Like what can you see from the perspective of a federal perspective or a wholesale market perspective, participating in those markets. It's mostly transmission connected, but it can include some distribution connected or even customer aggregations. And then we use the term distributed energy resources a lot. That's distribution connected or customer sited. And you'll hear me shorten that with DERs in the presentation. Another term we'll use is residual attributes of a resilience resource solution. So that's whatever's left over in terms of what services this resource could provide after it serves its primary resilience function. And serving its primary resilience function can mean operating, so actually providing the outage mitigation, or being on standby ready to provide that outage mitigation. And related to that, we use terms like value stacking and multiple use applications, which you all, I'm sure, are familiar with. That refers to different types of services provided at once or staggered over time, depending on how the resource's use case or operating strategy is defined. So with that, I'll move on to talking about the importance of the local perspective. So we've emphasized the locational diversity of resilience needs before in both of our prior presentations. This time we'll say it again, but we'll look at it from a different perspective in terms of circuit level outages. In our first presentation, we looked at resilience hazards across the nation, and we noted how many of them threaten the distribution system, including here in California, hazards like wildfire hazards. So when we look at the system that is behind the electricity service we're trying to make resilient, we have to consider what's going on with the distribution system. And this is different from the IRP perspective because IRP is a system level perspective, and it's that way for a reason. The IRP objectives of bulk grid reliability and GHG emissions reductions, those are system level needs. The chart here shows a metric that multiplies SAIDI, a measure of average duration of outages per year, by SAIFI, a measure of average frequency of outages per year, to get an estimate of average total outage hours per year experienced by customers. And this chart blends reported metrics from the 3 large IOUs in California. So you can see in the early years, customers experienced less than 2 outage hours per year on average. That's increasing over time and almost 4 hours per year in 2022. The dark teal at the bottom shows outages driven by the distribution system on non-major event days, and the lighter teal shows the effect of major event days. Pink shows transmission-driven outages on all days. The transmission is adjusted to include the 2020 rolling blackouts. Even with that, the bulk grid accounts for only 1% of outages experienced by customers. And this is just another way to show transmission connected resources procured through IRP that won't necessarily solve distribution level grid failures. And that resilient solutions, they must include investments in the distribution system and customer sites, including distributed energy resources or DERs. But although IRP looks at the system perspective, and it's important that it does that, it can procure resources across all grid domains. So there's an opportunity here for IRP to address resilience in a way that goes beyond the transmission connected resources. So let's drill into these outages a little bit more. This graph shows the same data, but it's for the year 2014 only. So it's one of the earlier years, and it's just for SCE. Instead of showing an average for all customers, this graph shows the outage metric at the circuit level. So what you see here, it looks like an area chart, but it's really a bar chart. It includes about 4,300 individual circuits in rank order. SCE's average outages per year in 2014 was about 1.8 hours. So 2/3 of the circuits had outages below that. You can see here on the right. And 1/3 of the circuits had outages higher than that. And as you look to the left of the graph, the outage hours sweep upward dramatically, with the highest at 500 hours. 5% of circuits had 24 or more hours of outages in 2014. So the distribution of outage experiences, it's skewed. Plus we see here a wide range of customer experiences with electricity service. And 2014 didn't have the major event days that we have today. This is just mostly a blue sky reliability experience. So this might look even more dramatic today. We also know that vulnerability indicators like the social burden index, which these Roseanne and Julian and the team have presented before on, and what we see in the utilities climate adaptation and vulnerability assessments, that they indicate a variety of customer experiences. And that resource needs and load prioritizations, they differ from one community to another. So again, resilient solutions, they must include customized resources built at the customer and community level. And how can we bring this local perspective into IRP? So we can't just do all of this from the IRP perspective alone. We don't have the right information. Look at what information the local authority has versus that community's load serving entity or LSC. Each has crucial information on the resilience risk profile, on hazards and failure points and impacts, and potential resource values that the other doesn't have. Both perspectives are needed for effective resilience planning. I'm going to pause here because I do see a hand up. Is it okay if we take this question now, or should I wait until the end of my section? I'll turn to Julian Julian or Roseanne on that.
Marco, totally up to you. This is your presentation. We'll let you drive. So if you want to take a question now. We can make that happen.
Okay, that'd be great. So Tam, please feel free. So if you have an urgent question, raise your hand. If you have a question that can wait for Q&A, please put it in the Q&A. So I'll take this question from Tam.
Great. And just a reminder, please state your name and affiliation at the top of your question. Tam, I've sent you a request to unmute, so go ahead.
I didn't realize you wanted us to wait for bigger questions to the end, but I'll ask it and you can decide. Yeah, so I appreciate you bringing up this interaction between resilience and reliability. And our understanding is there's not a clear demarcation point. I think there's pros and cons of looking at resilience in the reliability context, and maybe vice versa. One worry, of course, is looking at resilience in a reliability context risks subsuming that resilience debate, which is a bigger debate about reliable power in inclement conditions, major events, catastrophes, etc. It may somehow get lost in that bigger ongoing debate about reliability. So maybe you can reflect on that a little bit, either now or at the end of your talk.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I feel that when I talk about resilience versus reliability, I feel that pull into that bigger discussion. But Tam, do you have a view on that? Oh, sorry. I think we have to invite you to unmute.
Sorry, I asked your question again.
Oh, did you have a view on what that divide looks like, or how to define that divide between resilience and reliability?
I mean, I'll just kind of give you some thinking in the moment on it. We haven't written an official position on this, but my thinking in general is that resilience is about reliable power, not just during PSPS events, but also, other grid down events for whatever reason. Whereas reliability, of course, is, avoiding short-term grid outages, typically speaking, again, as, various definitions. And so our focus on resilience at this moment and this context in this proceeding, and in particular with microgrids, is looking at the best tools and the best toolkit to ensure more pervasive resilience in light of more serious events, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I'll just note something, another food for thought on this topic for the audience, if you're not familiar with. The IRP's reliability targets are based on a 1 in 10 loss of load expectation target. So that 1 in 10 loss of load expectation, that theoretically is based on a sort of stochastic modeling of the system under different situations and different possibilities, different contingencies, including some weather variability. But that 1 in 10 loss of load expectation, which is used throughout the nation, that has been used for a long time. and for many, many decades. And I think there's sort of like an open question of, as we're looking into resilience, just exactly what you're saying, Tam, what is that divide between reliability and resilience? Is it something that needs to change? Is it something that will change over time? So we don't have the answer to that, but I will bring it up a couple of times during this presentation. So thank you for the comment. Going back to this, talking about the different information that LSCs have versus local authorities, the LSCs, through their IRP, they have a view on broader system dynamics, including resource adequacy, major contingency events on the system, cascading and compounding effects of climate risks. And but customers and communities are the ones who really understand the problem at the local level, how load should be prioritized, the people's risk preferences, and where resources should be installed and what resource attributes are needed. So I don't think there's a way to address resilience in IRP without having both of these perspectives in the mix. And if we allow persistent disconnects here, today, local authorities and LSCs, while there are some examples of this working, they're not truly meeting in the IRP procurement marketplace. It's mostly the larger transmission connected resources. So if we allow persistent disconnects here, we risk building and using resources inefficiently and adding even more to the cost of living here. So we already know that local cost to local communities, to people, are inhibiting the ability to invest in resilience. And we already know that the LSCs are facing a ratepayer affordability crisis. So we need cost synergies, and we can't leave residual capacity on the table from the IRP perspective. And I'll add that, as the chart shows, not all IRP resources can help with local resilience, just as not all local resilience resources can help with bulk grid solutions, but there is something in the middle. And these are the resources that can value stack and help with both. And I believe that this is IRP's lever for really making a difference in resilient electricity service to customers. So I'll come back to this a few times in the presentation. So IRP doesn't need to change its system perspective completely. I believe it just needs more information on how to better target procurements. And local authorities need more information about how to capture market revenues that can help reduce the net cost of their resilience investments and better enable those investments. The LSCs are uniquely positioned to bridge this local versus IRP knowledge gap. The LSCs can integrate local concerns, needs, and priorities into the IRP process that Sarah described. The LSCs can connect local authorities with a better understanding of grid concerns, needs, priorities, and opportunities for bulk grid services. And the LSCs already have established communication channels with local authorities. I've got a couple of examples here. One example is the board of directors at Ava Community Energy, the CCA serving our area. That's composed of elected officials from each participating jurisdiction. That's the structure of CCA leadership. The IOUs as well have their channels to community leaders. So PG&E, for example, they have this community outreach program for wildfire safety. That's an example of the IOU's network of community liaisons. So I wanted to go to another polling question here. So go back to your browser, please, if you'd like to participate. I'll talk next about a methodology for bringing the local and LSC perspectives closer together in IRP. But before I do that, we're interested in what you think on this concept. For those of you who have some familiarity with the IRP process, the question is, to what degree are local resilience needs and priorities represented in current IRP planning and procurements? So to respond to this, please go back to polev.com/lumen999. If you're on your phone, you can also participate, but I highly recommend using your browser. And the options are none or not represented at all, low or not well represented with critical gaps, partially represented with some gaps, mostly well represented, minor gaps, or highly well represented. You can select one and you can edit your response. So what we're asking here, is this message resonating or are we missing something? Because this idea that the two perspectives are disconnected, that's sort of at the foundation of the methodology we're proposing. So we'd be interested to hear what you think of that. So the question is, to what degree are local resilience needs and priorities represented in current IRP planning and procurements? Let me make sure that this is refreshing. Okay. I do see it on the browser, but it is not updating here. Apologies for this technical glitch. Let me show you here. Okay. All right. So about 50% say that it's low or not well represented, 52%. Some say partially represented with some gaps, and then 16% say mostly well represented, with 4% high or very well represented. And it could be that it varies depending on the area that you're talking about. Some might have better representation than others, but thank you for your responses. This is very, very helpful. So I'll leave that open for another second, and then I will close that poll. All right. So what we see is two levels of planning that are happening in parallel, one at the local level, one at the state level. Each is in a way doing their own version of the 4 pillars framework. And the first part of our methodology is pretty straightforward. We believe the information exchange between local authorities and LSEs, that has to happen early in each respective planning process. Through this process, the LSEs can collect better information on the resilience problem and the needs in their service area, such as the DERs under consideration, and their desired operating profiles for resilience. And this can carve the path to meet local authorities in the procurement marketplace. Local authorities can learn more about the resilience risk profile, the potential grid benefits of resources, and then refine their resource strategies and designs from the start. And through this process, the LSEs can support meeting these local declared resilience needs. And just to be clear, the word support is intentional here. The needs for resilience energy resources, those are highly locational, and they must be tailored to the community, and the resilience benefits go to that community. So the decision to invest under our methodology is squarely in the local authorities' hands. So the LSEs are not buying resilience at the local level, but they are enabling resilience investments by offering grid revenues for residual attributes of a resilience energy resource. And this is an important point. If you have any reactions to that, please put it in the Q&A, and we're hoping to discuss that later. I got a note that the polls are taking a long time to load on phones and computers, and I apologize for that. We'll keep going. Sometimes it irons out on its own. But if you feel that you can't participate in the poll, please put any reactions in the Q&A or raise your hand. And then one thing we'll do is I'll try to also put up the results on the screen, and we'll have results also in our presentation, our post-workshop or post-informational session presentation that's online. Okay, so let's start with the process. We have a few slides like this where we sort of step through. I want to start with the local authorities and what they're doing. Right at the beginning, when they're identifying their reliability and resilience concerns, they're identifying their needs and their priorities. Here, they start to identify key attributes of resilience solutions, including the approximate size, the placement on the grid, operating profile, and this is where the local authorities are doing their initial evaluations related to pillars 1 and 2. So they're seeking outage mitigation, which may be in the form of enhanced reliability, Tam, as you were saying, and or improved resilience, and those two might be entangled. As you saw earlier also with the circuit outage data, the communities seeking resilient electricity service may also be seeking better reliability, even in non-major event days. Local authorities will also have more of an all hazards perspective compared to IRP. And they may not have the planning resources to analyze the full outage problem, the full set of future risks and interactions with the grid, but they can define what resilience means to their community. And they can identify their risk profile for electricity service interruptions and implications and their mitigation priorities. So they'll start to define these needs and required resource attributes. This will depend on the type of outage mitigation they're looking for. Is it hours they're worried about or days? Are they frequent outages? Is it under blue sky conditions, black sky conditions? What's the size of the resource they need? What's the expected operating profile? And are there any bill savings that they could realize? Do they have any of their own local preferred candidate resources? Through their IRP, the LSEs begin a type of Pillar 1 baseline assessment with the most recent preferred system plan. So I'll just note that this whole layout, this isn't how it works necessarily now. It may work this way in some areas, but this is all for discussion purposes only. And it's also not meant to reflect formal recommendations to the CPUC. So through their IRP, the LSEs can begin a type of Pillar 1 baseline assessment with starting with their most recent preferred system plan that Sarah was talking about. They're also exploring supply and demand scenarios to better understand key risks to the bulk grid's ability to meet reliability and GHG emission reduction goals. And we've also seen in recent years that the LSEs and the CPUC that they've been exploring climate projections and advancing their understanding of the risks there. And this is a really good time to have that information exchange with local authorities. The LSEs can collect information on what resource attributes local authorities are looking for, possibly what resource types even are preferred, and they can explore through their initial scoping and modeling, to what extent can local resources reduce outages given bulk grid data and climate projections? Are there any resilience concerns missing or misunderstood in the local information? And LSEs can help refine that local resilience risk profile by adding more of a system context, by adding the bulk grid perspective on a resilience definition, and with information on future grid conditions, including climate projections, considering a broader set of contingencies on the system, stochastic variables, and outcomes from their system modeling. So adding on to that local perspective on what the resilience risks are and what solutions might look like, LSEs can develop this view of a resilience definition and of the most relevant resilience events. They can estimate the non-resilience benefits of a resilience investment strategy, meaning the market value of residual attributes after the resources serve their local reliability or resilience needs. They can evaluate multiple resource strategies, and they can ask, well, does this resilient investment strategy at the local level, does that still make sense when we look at it from a system perspective? Is there a subset of DERs here that could value stack resilient services with system level services? They could even ask, can resources be resized or adjusted in operations to better reduce outages and/or to provide even more grid services? For a given strategy that passes that screen, they can evaluate that avoided resilience risk versus system cost trade-off. And they can send all of this information back to the local authorities to help the local authorities refine their resource plans, their resilience resource plans, and better position themselves for capturing market revenues if possible and participating in the IRP procurement process. So all of that sounds great, right? But for those of you who have worked with the resource planning models before, you might be saying that kind of evaluation of local resources doesn't really exist. Distributed energy resources, they're mostly represented as static resources in IRP level models. So when they're in the models, any growth on those resources, they're typically pre-processed inputs, usually pre-processed by either extrapolating growth rates from historical data or they're determined through more complex but high-level technology adoption models like S-curves. And even with all that, once you have the inputs for distributed energy resources, you've got them in the model, regardless of how you've done it, they are evaluated at the bulk grid level. So they're not evaluated in terms of customer level outages. And this is where our Warp to Resilience work steps in. The next 5 slides, I'll go through the key elements of the model that we're working on and how it can be used to better understand the resilience risk profile and evaluate resilience resource portfolios. So these are the same slides from our prior presentations. If you've seen this before, then I would encourage you to take a little break and come back maybe in 10 minutes. But please come back by slide 54. We're on 45 now, because we'll lead up to another poll related to procurement barriers and some Q&A, and I want to make sure that we get your thoughts there. So here's a flow chart of the model we're working on with key data sources in dark purple flowing into intermediate analyses. The size of the bubbles and connections, they loosely represent the analytical proximity to the model's core, which is focused on estimating outages at the customer level and identifying the and from that core in a loop, you see to the right a way to use raw outage outputs to identify the highest priority resilience situations you're worried about and identify resource attributes needed to help in those situations. And the model is designed to support analysis in all 4 pillars, from initial baseline assessment to testing the resource portfolios for resilience improvements. And I'll just say that no model is going to predict the future or take the place of human judgment and expertise under complex decision making. So this is a decision support tool, and it relies on user inputs and judgment calls at different levels on how to weight or prioritize outages. From our prior presentations, you can see how our resilience definition elements influence the model's architecture we've designed. The whole thing is centered on outages at the customer level. It's recognizing that not all outages are equally impactful and there's some need for prioritization. On the lower left, we have representation of both bulk grid characteristics and characteristics of more local areas, the local distribution system characteristics. And so grid stressors and failure points, they can be evaluated both at the bulk system level and at the more local level. And if you look at the top left, we've got historical and future weather hazards. They help us construct stressors on both demand and supply in the model. And then other data sources like meter data or derivations of meter data, vulnerability metrics such as the social burden index and the climate adaptation vulnerability assessment results discussed in your prior workshops. They help us disaggregate outage results into customer and community categories that drive outage severity. So basically everything on the left side of the chart helps us to capture key failure points and hazards, and everything on the right helps us to identify key impacts and resilience planning priorities. And this is a stochastic model, so it's similar to a loss of load type model designed to do many iterations of the same planning year. Just like resource adequacy in IRP, resilience investment, whether that's a specific resource or a portfolio of resources, it functions like insurance. We don't know exactly when or where a resilience event will happen, but when it does happen, we want the resource to be there ready. So to understand resilience value, it's not enough to see how it performs in a single run or a single representation of grid conditions in the planning year. And to even understand when the resource needs to be ready and available, we first need to observe in our baseline assessment, what are the possibilities in terms of how hazards and failure points translate into outages. So that's the reasoning for the stochastic model, stochastic elements of the model. So what we can do with a stochastic model is we can run many different versions of the planning year in our baseline assessment to get a feel for the range and distribution of possible outage outcomes. And we can explore how would a resilience resource likely need to deliver services. Is it mostly in fire season or is it mostly in rain season? What about in blue sky versus black sky conditions? So we can start with our weather variants. carrying through how those affect demand and supply, and including stochastic variables for forced outages and derates with layers for both blue sky conditions and more extreme conditions. And let's say we end up with thousands of different versions of what outages could look like in a given planning year. So we're not trying to plan for every single future, every single type of outage situation. That's unreasonable. Across many simulations of what a given year could look like, how well does a seasonal operating profile work? That's something that we could look at. Or how do you have to have the resource on standby? Do you have to have the resource on standby year round, or are there exceptions to that? But we can explore through the stochastic approach where there are opportunities to provide bulk grid services, and for resources that can provide bulk grid services, better understand the risk tolerances of when you provide those services and the trade-offs for stacking that value onto local resilience services. Also, we don't want the model to decide for us what's high priority. We want to look at the data and then make the decisions on priorities and customize to that local resilience perspective when we get information from local authorities. Looking at the range of outage outcomes and situations from the stochastic model, we think it would be possible from there to then narrow down to the most concerning outcomes from a resilience planning situation and refine our understanding of the magnitude and time profile of resilience risks. And by doing that, you're sorting out the runs to untangle what's high priority versus lower priority. But you're also maybe starting to untangle your own view of what's reliability versus resilience. So this is just an illustration of what it would mean to prioritize and reweight outage results in a stochastic model. So let's say you have thousands of outage outcomes for your planning year shown in this left chart. Each run can be summarized as a total unserved energy or loss of load in kilowatt hours in the planning year on the x-axis. And on the y-axis shows how many of your runs have that quantity of loss of load. In the middle, there's your loss of load expectation or LOLI. And let's say you've decided that your community has zero tolerance for multi-day outages for residential customers. So that's your top planning priority, is to reduce that. All of the pink highlighted bars, let's say those contain runs that have multi-day outages for residential customers. If you could go back to your outage results and give all the multi-day outages for residential customers a weighting or a multiplier to represent that prioritization, then you move all your runs of concern to the right of the distribution, as you see on the graph on the right. Now, these are no longer in kilowatt hour units, they're weighted kilowatt hours, but now the distribution better reflects your risk tolerances. So from there, you can pick a subset of runs. Let's say here, all the runs in the 90th to 95th percentile in terms of total weighted loss of load, and you can focus on that subset of runs in your resilience planning. And also, once you refine that resilience risk profile, you can get a better sense of what resource attributes you're looking for. And then you can start exploring, if I build this thing for resilience, would it be possible to layer on services to the grid at times when I know my resilience risk is low? When you subset the runs, this is where you really have to think about that reliability versus resilience risk threshold. When does a situation elevate to a resilience problem? So you could look at one of the 90th percentile runs, let's say, and then pull an 85th percentile run. Is the 85th percentile run looking more like a situation that you think is already captured in reliability analysis? A situation that's through reliability, through the industry's reliability practices, that's acceptable as long as the average for the system is that 1 in 10 LOLI? Or does that 85th percentile run look more like a resilience problem to you? And that information can tell you, do you need to change that threshold? Maybe lower the threshold by subsetting the runs down to the 85th percentile. And also when you subset the runs, you can go back and get a better picture on what hazards and failure points are driving those outcomes specifically. So you could take those runs and say, okay, what is causing those outages and those failures? And that will help you understand if you're focusing on the right resilience hazards and failure points to begin with. So this is when the 4 pillars can get kind of iterative as you learn more information going through the process. So it's a nonlinear approach. It takes some data exploration and judgment calls, but that's what's needed for complex decision making, and we don't want to bypass that process. So for resources that can value stack, the decision on when to operate for resilience versus when to operate for bulk services, that depends on the local community's outage risk tolerances. It's likely that the local versus system needs, that they'll conflict sometimes. And if you really want to minimize all outages at any cost, you might not want to provide any grid services at all and have that resource on standby all the time. In this chart, this is conceptual. That might mean that although your main concern is wildfire risk, let's say in wildfire season, you're totally risk averse and you want to keep that resource on standby year round. Or maybe you're more risk neutral and you're willing to offer services to the grid in the spring where there isn't really wildfire risk and when the bulk grid has the highest need for storage resources, say, to avoid renewable curtailment. Or maybe you're more risk tolerant and willing to even take on some local outage risk in order to provide bulk grid reliability services in the summer. So this is all up to the local authorities and the communities to decide what works for them. But this learning process with the LSEs will enable an enhanced look at this and what these trade-offs mean. So moving on, the local authorities can refine their assessments with this new information from the LSEs. And the LSEs can use this information to screen new DER resource types for inclusion in IRP modeling. Which ones are likely to be invested in given the local resilience perspective? Which ones are feasible? Which have the potential residual attributes for system services, bulk grid services? And with that, they can also refine the operating profile of DERs in the IRP models. So instead of extrapolating from historical patterns, they can really customize to what the local needs are for resilience. And from there, LSEs can model their candidate IRP resources using their current modeling toolkit. And remember, through these tools, they're also exploring resilience up at the bulk grid level, which is also needed. And we'll talk about that in the last part of our presentation. And refining this DER operating profile, they can better represent synergies and even potentially conflicts with the local versus system capacity needs. And they can explore what's that trade-off of local resources versus bulk grid resources. What's that subset of DERs that can value stack? So Onur's going to talk about this a little bit more. I'll hand that over to him.
In the first workshop, we asked the stakeholders what they thought as the greatest barrier to effective resilience planning, and cost came at the top of that list. So I want to talk a little bit about cost effectiveness. So when assessing the economics of resilience investments, it's important to consider not only the level of increase in resilience, but also the net cost of achieving that resilience level. And this can be, we discussed in the prior workshop, this can be done by combining some of the key features of metrics like net CON, net cost of new entry, and RSC, risk spent efficiency. Net CON reflects the amount of capacity payments a resource would need to support its investment. And RSC is used by the utilities to compare cost effectiveness of risk mitigation programs based on the ratio of risk reduction to the underlying program costs. Next slide, please. So here we demonstrate how to calculate a cost metric for resilience investments using similar concepts. So just like in net CON, the total cost would include levelized capital and operating costs, and they would be offset by non-resilience benefits. So, for example, from services provided to the bulk grid under blue sky conditions, may include energy, ancillary services, resource adequacy, and so on. Important to note that not all resilience solutions would be as effective in reducing the risk exposure. So it's important to account for that and normalize the net cost of, by the degree of resilience improvements provided by the resources when we use the metric to compare different alternatives. So looking at that, the ratio can be flipped to show resilience improvement per dollar spent, just like an RSC-like metric. So regardless of what you include in the numerator versus denominator, it would have the same ingredients though. And here I want to highlight that, regardless of how you frame the metric, that capturing some of those grid benefits to offset the cost would likely require changes to contractual and operating priorities at certain times. And this can increase the residual risks. So it's important. It's an important trade-off that needs to be considered by the local authorities in their planning. So next we show, next slide, please. Yeah, so this is an example we covered in our September workshop to demonstrate the risk and economic trade-off. It's an example for a resource under different use cases. So starting from the top, the use case A prioritizes resilience around the clock at all times and assumed to result in nearly 100% outage mitigation. But to do that, it cannot offer any grid services, so there would be no cost offsets associated with the grid services. In our example back in September, the grid value, we estimated it to be highest in May through August, where for the example we consider there is also a relatively low outage risk. So in use case B, the resources capacity is offered to the grid in that period, May through August, which offsets project's cost by half, which is significant. And it does that with very little change in outage mitigation levels. So the outage mitigation goes down from 100% to 95%. But then extending the grid services to other periods, even though it can further increase the cost offsets and potentially make the project more cost effective, it also reduced the mitigation levels drastically, and that's shown in cases C and D. So when we look at across these four cases, you can see that it's really difficult, if at all possible, to find a one-size-fits-all solution. The optimal choice would depend on characteristics of the customers that are affected, and also their unique risk profiles and preferences. So for example, a customer with a lot of critical loads can look at this and say, I'm not willing to take in a risk. I'll go with case A and accept the high cost. But then another customer with more discretionary loads might prefer B or C instead, and willing to take some residual risk in exchange for major cost reductions. So overall, to evaluate the trade-offs I described here, you need information from both local information on both local planning needs and the risk profiles, as well as the broad system level needs and benefits, which is a key motivation for increased coordination in between. So I'll pass it back to Mariko.
Thank you, Owner. And I do see that we have a couple of really good questions and comments in the Q&A. So Sam, if you wouldn't mind holding on for 3 more slides, we've got a polling Q&A that is related to your question and concern. And then Jaren, Julian, is it okay if I read Jaren's question and address that now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. So Jaren says, the resilience section mentions disaster, but what about pressure to move away from disruptive safety measures through hardening? As an example, EPSS or PSPS was implemented as a short-term solution to fire risk, but in itself presents substantial disaster-like conditions to grids in the WUI, the wildland-urban interface. What moves an LSC into tree shielding, sectionalizers, and undergrounding? And that's a really good comment. It really resonates for me because Owner and I are in Tier 3 wildfire threat area. So what you're describing is our life. Even with the presentation now, we're just grateful that it's rained. Otherwise, we'd have a risk of being on outage during this meeting. So how I would react to this is on the question, what moves an LSC into tree shielding, sectionalizers, and undergrounding? What I think of is the wildfire mitigation plans and those proceedings. So Jaren, are you involved in those at all or familiar with those? let me invite you to, if you request unmute, I think we might be able to unmute you, or maybe we need to do that. Try and find you. Maybe if you could raise your hand, Jaren, that would be helpful. And then while we're waiting for that, so the other reaction that I would have is these are tree shielding, sectionalizers, and undergrounding. These are certainly mitigation measures that are important. Within the IRP context, though, these don't really present a lever for IRP procurement, because IRP is procuring resources to provide those bulk grid services, which an undergrounded wire can't provide. So you could think of an undergrounded wire or sectionalizer or tree shielding as a resilience resource. It is a resilience resource, but it's not a resilience energy resource that can provide upstream services to the bulk grid, if that makes sense. So we don't see those mitigation measures as being something, as being an IRP lever that LSCs can pull through the IRP proceeding and framework.
Can I add one thing on that?
Yeah, please.
So, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, as Marco said, the IRP focusing is on energy resources as opposed to wire solutions. But I think it's important somewhere in the planning process for, not necessarily in the IRP, but somewhere in the planning process, the wires and non-wire solutions are compared side by side. And the trade-offs are in between are discussed, and that discussion should involve reliability, resilience, safety, and also economic trade-offs. I think.
Great. And so, Jaren, if that didn't answer your question, or if you have more to add, feel free to raise your hand. And then Sam will get to your question soon. So thank you, Owner. And let's see. Where we're trying to go here is better understand IRP resource strategies, how IRP resource strategies can improve the economics of resilience investments while also benefiting ratepayers. So if the entire resource must always be on reserve for resilience, like those wires solutions, or in other words, there's no residual attributes available to the system, then there's no IRP lever, in our view, to support that particular resilience improvement. But it's still useful information for the LSC's baseline assessment of where the resilience problem is. For resilience resources that can value stack, that is a resilience improvement that IRP can help enable through procurements. So with those resources, you could consider modeling these grid available resilience resources in two pieces. The portion of capacity needed to be on reserve for resilience as a pillar 2 mitigation measure impact. So that can be a potentially IRP supported resilience improvement. And then the portion, the residual attributes, you can model those as grid available that can potentially reduce the need for transmission connected resources to help meet reliability and GHG emission reduction goals. So I don't want to harp on this point for too long, but hopefully you get the point on the methodology that we're suggesting here. And to bring this home, we want, and to say it again, we want the local authorities and the LSCs to be better positioned to then meet in the IRP procurement marketplace. With local resource development plans better tailored to maximizing grid revenues subject to the community's risk tolerances, and with LSC procurements better targeting value stacking opportunities that provide local resilience. So LSCs can target value stacking opportunities through their contracts, incentive programs, tariffs, and associated rates. And these can be designed based on the outcome of their IRPs under the methodology that we would propose and their better understanding of resilience resources on the horizon. They can be better tailored to utilize and support through grid revenues, the local resilience investments. And all of this is to address the planning barriers to local authorities and LSCs meeting in the IRP procurement marketplace to meet reliability, GHG emission reduction, and resilience needs. And so now we're starting to get into your question, Sam. Once you get there, there still might be barriers in the procurement and resource development processes, some of which I believe are being explored and discussed in the resiliency and microgrids proceeding, like operating agreements, some which might not be. So we have a question to you, and that is, what are the barriers to LSC's procurements of local resilience resources for grid services for multiple use applications and value stacking? And some questions we have is, we know there's a cost barrier at the local level. What else is behind that? Is it interconnection, energization, timeline, cost, logistics? Those all add to cost if they're difficult. Contract structures, ability to tailor those structures and figure out risk sharing with the procuring entities, operating agreements. So I'll put up this poll, and apologies again if this takes a while to load. But the question is, beyond the planning process, what are the top procurement and development barriers to IRP procurement of resilience energy resources? So you can select up to 3. Again, go to the same URL, that's pollev.com/lumen999. You can also participate over phone, but I highly recommend doing this through the browser. So the options are RFP process, bid evaluations, contract structures, interconnection, permitting, local financing, and others. And Sam suggested in the Q&A that transmission charges are a barrier. If you answer other, we also have a word cloud for you, which I'll start up right after this one, and you can put in what you, your idea of what the other barriers are. So I'll give you a minute to work on this, and I may need to show you, I'll show you the results this way because slides are not being nice. Alrighty. So it looks like a lot of people are choosing interconnection and RFP process. We've also got a lot of other, which is good because we've got a word cloud for you to fill in your thoughts on that. So I'll leave this up for a few minutes. And while we're waiting and watching this bar chart evolve, wanted to ask our hosts if we're doing okay on time, if we're ahead or behind.
Quite a bit ahead, so we are ahead by about 15 or so minutes.
Okay, that's great. I actually like to hear that because it means we can have more discussion. So that's good. Okay, about 30% of people are saying interconnection. Yeah, that makes sense. And RFP process is a big one too, and other. Okay, so let me start up the word cloud. And if you answered other, or if you feel that the category you picked doesn't quite convey what you have in mind in terms of barriers other than the planning process, please feel free to populate the word cloud. And I will find, oh, here we go. Yes, this one is working. Okay, definitely grid is a word that everyone is using. I'm seeing some misalignment, uncertainty, political, penalizes. If you want to explain your responses here at all, please feel free to raise your hand or put it in the Q&A. We also look at the full responses after the workshop. Again, they're all anonymous. We can't tell who said what, but we can see the complete responses, and usually they make more sense, so we can comment on that later. But I'll keep this open for another minute or so, and then we will, I think what we have next up is a Q&A. All right, I will keep that word cloud up if people want to keep putting responses in. And then we can move to Q&A, and I'm hoping to start with Sam's comment on transmission charges, if that's okay.
Yeah, please feel free to answer that, and I'll let you know if any more Q&A comes in or if there are any raised hands that we can address.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Sam, you said that LSC procurement for local resilience value is undercut by customer transmission charges being applied to local distributed resources. How can we address this disincentive against procuring local resources that support resilience? Even if IRP credited local resources for avoided future transmission capacity in the preferred system plan, which is not currently included in the avoided cost calculator, how would this flow into economic-based procurement decisions by each LSE? That's a really good question and a very valid concern. I would open that to see if anyone had any reactions to that from the CPUC or owner. Did you have any reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would. I think in terms of the transmission access charges, it's challenging. I mean, I think to the extent that the distributed resource draws power from the grid at certain times, acts as a load, I think, and to the extent that that can lead to some network upgrade charges at the transmission level, I think those transmission charges are needed for economic efficiency. So even though it might create some disincentive compared to a world where those charges don't exist. But I think, to the extent that, so my understanding is as a part of the, and I think there's a current, under the current proceeding, the avoided cost calculator assumptions are being updated, but the avoided transmission and avoided distribution costs are part of that, that tool and the calculations of the avoided cost calculators. Although I think it's challenging to really pinpoint, I think a lot of those avoided costs are unspecified resources based on kind of zonal or system-wide assumptions. So I think to the extent that a resource has a specific avoided transmission project, I think the question is how could that flow into the procurement decision, especially if the LSC is one of the CCAs, not one of the IOUs. And I think that just, to me, that ties to some of the value stacking challenges that Michael was describing. We've done a study about like energy storage resources evaluation, and we had a report out earlier this year where we've looked into resources connected at all grid domains, including not only transmission but also distribution and customer sided, distribution connected and customer sided. We've seen resources that are procured, including third-party resources, not just IOU-owned, third-party distribution connected resources that were procured, including as a part of the DIDF efforts. I think the challenge is that so there are ways to monetize that benefit stream, where there can be a contract, a third-party contract, to really pay for the services that would, at the end, defer at least distribution system investments. But I think the challenge is that that's a fast-moving target. So, what we've seen in that study was that a lot of the projects that were procured for that purpose, the time when they were procured and when they were actually built, that the need went away. And I think the procurement wasn't flexible enough to adjust for that, and then so the projects got canceled. A lot of those projects got canceled. So I think that is one thing. But how can you build in uncertainty, and it might be just not be too specific about the need. If the need is uncertain, how do you bring in that uncertainty around that need, which may grow or it might go away, into the decision-making process and the procurement? I think that is a big challenge, and I don't have a short answer for that, but I think that's a really good question. And clearly, there might be.
Sam is unmuted. Did you want to add to that, Sam?
Yes, thank you. Just to follow up and clarify for that, you touched on some of the problems with the DIDF procurement process, but we've seen historically that that is extremely challenging and has not worked effectively. And we don't need to go into all the reasons why right now. But in terms of the avoided transmission costs, the ACC does credit where there is a specific project which can be avoided if that project has already been planned. However, if an LSE, a procurement agency such as a CCA, meets all of its future load through local resources such that no additional transmission is needed for that area, that transmission will not be planned. But that transmission would have otherwise been planned and needed had they not, met their resources locally. The ACC has no system for currently for crediting or calculating those unspecified or not yet specifically planned projects. So we have to get to a point where a need has already been recognized, a project planned before there's any credit for avoiding that need in the first place.
Right.
And especially because the LSE, which is not the same as a grid operator, is procuring on a cost basis. Their customers are going to be do not receive any individual credit as LSE customers for avoiding a future transmission need that's in there, which means that any selection of local resources is usually not the least cost selection for the LSE. As an LSE, as a CCA. It may be the least cost selection for ratepayers, but the procuring agency doesn't see that for its customers and therefore has a disincentive to select those local resources.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, Sam. So maybe this might be more of a question for Roseanne and Julian, but in the microgrids and resiliency proceeding right now, are any tariff structures being considered that touch on any kind of avoided transmission credit?
So I will speak to this sort of more generally, I think. But perhaps that's something that we can pass along for an answer. I will say we're not the microgrids proceeding right now is, I think, is broadly considering the best way to structure a tariff and process that governs simply how front of meter microgrids are operated and sort of integrated with the grid. We're not touching on any sort of compensatory structures surrounding the individual resources within the microgrid, because in blue sky conditions they are simply being treated as system resources with the attendant sort of otherwise applicable tariffs and rules that govern them, that govern simply their interconnection to the system. It's only when that transitions to sort of black sky outage mode that we're sort of considering them. So that's really, I think, probably the best description of it. Roseanne, please, feel free to correct that if I've stuck my foot in my mouth. But I don't think that's really something that we are considering there. Roseanne, you're coming through really faintly. We didn't catch any of that.
You handled that very well, and that's not something that I'm proceeding, but it might be something that some other related proceedings that we.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, so CPUC, and I was, I'm planning to touch on that more in the next part of our session. But CPUC instituted a new rulemaking, 2211 013. So that's a successor to the IDR to really consider the DER program cost effectiveness issues and kind of, including coordination amongst various DER proceedings, programs, and also the IRP proceeding. So, I mean, that might be an outlet to bring in some of those barriers and discuss, how to address those.
One thing I'll add from the IRP side. So in August, our ALJ issued a scoping memo for where the proceeding is going to go for the sort of foreseeable future, next 1 to 2 years. And one of the things that IRP staff has scoped is it's slightly different, but it is a local reliability webinar that we'll be seeking stakeholder feedback on. So to the extent that there are microgrid stakeholders that want to participate in that, I would just encourage you to join our Modeling Advisory Group or MAG webinar on local reliability analysis.
And how do we find information on that? Sarah, is it through the service list for IRP or is it on the website?
Yeah, so the information isn't available yet. The webinar isn't scheduled, but we will notify the service list when we schedule it. For more information, just generally on what's in scope, though, I can drop the scoping memo in the Q&A so that folks can read through sort of a high level of what we have planned for that.
Okay, great. And then Sam, if you have any, if you happen to know of any other jurisdictions, whether that's nationally or internationally, where you think that this works, I'd be interested to learn more about it. So you can feel free to put that in the Q&A or email me. It's mariko@lumenenergystrategy.com. Thanks for your comment. And I think we have a couple other hands up.
Yeah, we do.
Right.
So we'll go ahead and get to them in the order they came in. Just a reminder to folks, before your question or your comment, please go ahead and state your name and your organization for our information. Claire Broom, I've sent you a request to.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you fine.
Great. Claire Broom, 350 Bay Area. And Mariko, to answer your question, the California municipal utilities bill the transmission access charge at the interface with the transmission grid rather than at the customer meter. So there's certainly a perfectly good precedent for more accurately allocating transmission charges. My question, this is a fascinating and really important analysis. And I think in addition to the needs for resilience, all of us who care about the environment and California ratepayers are very concerned about recognizing the value stack for DERs, which, and I put in my word cloud comment, one of the problems is the understandable siloing into proceedings so that you're not looking across the different ways that DER can provide value. And I know we're on microgrids today, but I would hope, I'd be very interested in how your modeling can incorporate, when you say you just sort of give blanket grid services that the DERs can provide in addition to resiliency benefits, and that's great. I would be interested in how well your modeling could potentially capture the avoided transmission infrastructure, avoided distribution infrastructure, if you look at the DER ability to load shift, you have very real opportunities for decreasing peak capacity on a circuit, which is certainly one of the drivers for additional investments in distribution infrastructure, which are a major contributor to accelerating California utility rates. So I guess I'm wondering how broadly you're looking at the potential grid services affordability benefits you can identify, and also how that gets incorporated into IRP planning. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire. That's a really insightful question. I'll answer your question directly on our models. So our model is more of a structured as a pipes and bubbles supply sufficiency model. So it doesn't model individual wires. So we wouldn't be able to get at the concern you're asking about, what would be the avoided transmission distribution investments, unfortunately. But then how to incorporate that into IRP, I guess that's an open question. Did you have any thought on that, or anyone from the CPUC?
That's a tough problem, and I think I would just, and I think it's something, and again, I don't want to speak for the CPUC, but I think it's something that's recognized by a variety of stakeholders, and I think it might be at the core of that new rulemaking that I described. Where how do you increase coordination for more cost effectiveness across the different DER proceedings and programs, and also the IRP? How can you bring in, because and I'll just touch on that more later, but I think right now the IRP modeling is taking, like, the DERs are largely modeled as static profiles. So it's embedded really early on in the load forecasting through load modifiers, where the CEC really develops those profiles, and then that information flows down to the CPUC and the LSCs for the IRP analysis. But I think there is a real opportunity here for, like, considering some of those contributions that including the ones that you mentioned. It wouldn't be addressed within the model that we're describing, like that we would be working on, but it is definitely something that's important and hopefully will be addressed as a part of that proceeding.
Yeah, so we don't have a solid answer for you, Claire, but you've given us something to think about and discuss. So thank you for that.
Great. Thanks, Marco Noner, for fielding that. We'll move on. We have another raised hand from Tam Hunt. Tam, go ahead. You're unmuted. And just a reminder, please state your affiliation.
Hi, Tam Hunt, Green Power Institute. And just going back to your comment, Julian, a minute ago, and Roseanne's comment, which I couldn't hear actually. So if you could, either you, Julian, or both of you, clarify your comment, which I find kind of puzzling, that you're not currently looking at compensation issues in relation to tariff. This was, as you know, because you were there, Julian and Roseanne, discussed in the RMWG workshops a couple of years ago. GPI presented on our proposed tariff that would include compensation issues. So it has been discussed in this proceeding. It's news to, I think, everyone here that you're not currently considering compensation in relation to tariffs, particularly given that the tariffs are due on the record in now a couple weeks. So could you kind of just talk a bit about all that?
So for, I'll at least offer this as, my standard disclaimer that I don't speak for the commission, and, anything I say is reading the tea leaves and not, what action the commission may or may not take, sort of within that context. I think I am certainly a little bit less involved with that side of the team, and the continuing work on the emerging multi-property tariff that's going on, and seeing the scoping ruling go out today that modifies the schedule of the scopes that parties can submit their proposals for tariffs within sort of the framework of that multi-property. So perhaps I spoke too soon. I think my comment was a little bit more generally related to these large generating resources that have their sort of their own sort of rules and compensatory structures that are already in place during blue sky operations. I think I was more directing my comment at that. We will be considering both what the utilities submitted to us by advice letter for those tariffs, as well as what parties have submitted as well in terms of those tariffs. And we will be considering those going forward. But again, my comment was mostly about blue sky operations of these resources, rather than anything that happens potentially in an outage condition or not. So hopefully that clarifies my comment a little bit more.
That is helpful. Yeah, thank you. And I'll just add, and I know today's not the discussion forum for this, but I'll just add this and we can close it out. Other parties will be proposing compensation mechanisms, and it is, in our view and other parties' view, also pretty imperative to have compensation options during blue sky conditions as well as during black sky conditions in order to make them economically viable. Every microgrid, well, I should say most microgrids online to date in this context have had large grant funding. That, of course, is not a viable model for commercializing, which is the mandate of SB 1339, microgrids more generally. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks, Sam, and look forward to seeing your proposal within that track of the microgrids proceeding in track 5. Real quick, I see Jeremy has a hand up, and I assume this is Jeremy Donnell. So Jeremy, go ahead. You're unmuted. Please let us know your affiliation.
Pacific Gas and Electric. I just want to comment on the last comment by Tam that commercially viable means that a product can actually sustain itself without subsidy. Ongoing subsidies is not a commercially viable product. And so when we think about compensation, the goal should not be to ensure that microgrids can be constructed and earn money. The goal should be to figure out which microgrids actually produce benefits to the grid that can be compensated by the utility, and to customers that can be paid for by those specific customers.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, Jeremy. I don't want us to sort of go down this road, because I don't think this is sort of the workshop to do that. We're talking about higher level IRP considerations and the integration with resiliency. So I just want to I don't want to curtail discussion, but I also feel that this maybe this particular line of discussion isn't going to be the most helpful moving forward to sort of understanding what Mariko and Owner have presented here. So with that, I think we have some written Q&A. Mariko, if you want to address that.
Sure. Let's see. So Jalal from Turn was asking about a public repository for the input data used and possibility to access the model. Answer is yes. We are EPIC funded. So, and part of the EPIC program is we want everyone to learn from everything we're doing. We want everyone to use the tools. So the plan is to post everything. We're aiming to, we'll get this on, we have a schedule slide later on in the deck, but we're aiming to publish a beta version of the model mid-year next year. And before that, we'll have weather and demand related data, which we used to support the CEC's demand forecasting unit for the 2023 IPER cycle. So you'll see that even sooner, and then more to come after that. Sam has another comment or question, but I would just want to make sure we're good on time right now, because I think we owe everyone a break. Should we do that first and then answer a question, or should we answer the question first?
Since we're in the Q&A session, we're in the flow. Let's maybe go ahead and answer that question.
Okay. Okay, so Sam says, note that energy procurement and capacity costs are roughly half to a third of the wire's delivery cost for ratepayers. But half or a third of the wire's delivery cost. Does that mean total cost? But location of energy resources is a primary driver of wires cost, i.e. distance and capacity. Can IRP focus on the total deliver cost, okay, of energy to optimize locational factors of PSP? I'm not sure if this is a question for us or for Sarah, Sam, right now. Do you mind clarifying?
Sam, you're muted. Go ahead.
There we go. Thanks.
Oh, Sam, I'm sorry.
Yes, there's often a disconnect between the cost of energy procurement at the place where it's generated and the cost of getting that energy actually to the customer, to the load. When you look at your energy bill, the procurement component of energy, including capacity and RA payments, is a small fraction of the average customer bill. The cost of getting the energy from where it is generated to where it's needed is a much larger component of the customer bill. So that's the delivery cost of energy.
Right.
So you can look at just the IRP procurement to have the energy you need, but in a preferred system plan or optimization of that from a ratepayer perspective, you really want to be looking at how each of these resources compare in the total cost of both procurement and delivery when you need, especially when the majority of the cost is actually that shipping and handling to get it to the customer. And if you can select resources that reduce the total quantity in both capacity and distance of the wires, that is the larger factor in cost effectiveness.
That makes sense. So I think Sarah, jump in whenever you like. So IRP models typically are focused on cost to deliver to the pool transmission facility. So they're not looking any further downstream. That's an industry standard for how those models are structured. For our model that we're developing, it's a loss of load model, so it's really not optimizing for cost. But I suppose in a IRP type model, you could sort of get around that some by when you have candidate resources, you can adjust the installation cost of those candidate resources to give them sort of like a credit for any avoided downstream cost. But that's just speculation that I'm offering. So, but this gives us something really good to think about. So thank you for that question and comment.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just offer for anything that's sort of related to PSP or IRP modeling, the venue to address changes would be through our inputs and assumptions development. And so we usually stakeholder that and solicit feedback from stakeholders who might have requested changes for how we might want to consider things within the modeling. And then, we work with our consultants hand in hand in our energy resource modeling team to either take into account some of those changes or provide rationale for why we might not consider it. So for something that would change resource cost or consideration, I guess the guidance would be data has to be sort of publicly available and others need to be able to use it. And so, as we look towards future IRP cycles and future INAs, it's not to preclude those changes, but I would encourage stakeholders that are interested in IRP modeling to participate on the IRP side, and particularly in the inputs and assumptions development.
Yeah, great. So if anything that you're hearing resonates, please participate in IRP as well. And we can really bridge that gap that you're seeing. That would be great. So should we do a quick break or should we keep going?
We somehow thought we were like 15 minutes ahead, but I think we're like now 15 minutes behind? I mean, those are really good questions, but
Yeah.
just I think for the interest of time, I wonder if we should keep going or maybe take a very short break. I don't know, Julian.
Let's take a 5-minute break instead of 10, and then proceed from there.
Okay.
Sounds
Very
great. We'll be back in 5 minutes. Continue on. All right, and I'll turn it back over to Mariko.
Thank you. Our final section is on methodology for incorporating local resilience needs and system-wide climate risks, and Onur's going to take us through that.
Thanks, Mariko. So yeah, I think we need to go a little faster than planned. Have some catching up, but so I want to discuss how we could incorporate local resilience into IRP process with some examples, and also want to take a little bit of time to provide a brief overview of our recent work with the CEC to improve how climate change is considered in demand forecasting, which is a key input to IRP and grid planning. IRP is a potential venue for building resilience at scale with a system perspective. Public Utilities Code, and Sarah mentioned that too, explicitly requires the LSC's IRPs to strengthen the diversity, sustainability, and resilience of the bulk transmission, distribution systems, and also local communities. So, and again, we discussed this during our initial workshops, but it's worth repeating today, that without a clear definition of resilience and a set of metrics to evaluate resilience improvements, this requirement has so far been mostly open-ended and subject to interpretation and addressed largely qualitatively through the IRPs. In California, there are many efforts that are centered around resilience, a lot of investments, pilot programs, climate adaptation work, and so on. But today, these efforts are largely disconnected from IRP. And there's a lot of opportunity. IRP process by design has the bird's eye view on system level needs. And accordingly, it's in a unique position to facilitate the coordination needed to bring in local perspectives and resilience into the grid planning. Next slide, please. The clean energy transition coupled with resilience-related vulnerabilities raise the stakes in grid planning. There are many moving parts and challenges to consider and plan for here. Today's resilience solutions must be in line with climate and environmental goals. It no longer install a diesel backup generator in a sustainable way. There are many challenges and institutional barriers associated with planning for a system with very high levels of renewables and high levels of distributed energy resources. Assessments of portfolio level needs and resource contributions towards meeting those needs are becoming more complex. Electrification, it's an essential part of the clean energy transition, but it will create new uncertainties and shift the areas of vulnerabilities on the grid. And the planning processes need to also address equity issues, where there's this very high socioeconomic burden on disadvantaged and vulnerable communities. And on top of all that, climate scientists are finding with very high confidence that the climate change is making it more likely to have multiple environmental hazards simultaneously, resulting in compounding risks that needs to be addressed operationally and also through better planning. So with these emerging challenges, California will need to, can we go back? Yeah, so with these emerging challenges, California will need to will need significant grid investments in the next decade. And that will be across all grid domains, including the bulk grid, the distribution system, and also at customer sites. And addressing the potential affordability crisis that might be related to that will require continued and increased emphasis on cost effectiveness in planning. Next slide, please. So we discussed a little bit early on. So meeting the bulk grid distribution system and customer needs require better coordination across planning, procurement, and program design. And today's resilience energy resources include flexible resources like energy storage or hybrid resources that can address not only the customer's resilience needs, but also provide benefits to the bulk grid and support states' clean energy transition. So this means that the bulk grid planning needs to consider contributions of these distributed resources, and also their limitations that might be tied to resilience-related services. So as Marco discussed earlier, considering value stacking opportunities is also important when looking at resilience solutions at the local level, because it can reduce the net cost to providing resilience. It can impact relative rankings of alternatives that are considered. And as I mentioned earlier, in the IRP models, most DERs are modeled with static profiles with little or no operational flexibility. And as a result, the DERs are not yet completely incorporated into the IRP modeling as candidate resources. So recognizing this, CPUC recently opened a new rulemaking that I mentioned earlier as a successor to the IDER proceeding to tackle DER program cost effectiveness issues and improve coordination across DER and IRP proceedings. This is really critical. And this coordination is critical not only for the cost effectiveness of the DER programs and investments, but also for the cost effectiveness of the IRP portfolio. Next slide, please. In our previous workshop, and Marco covered today as well, the stakeholders agreed that it's really important to capture the different characteristics of the outage events, and also the different types of customers and loads impacted as a part of the resilience definition and also resilience-related metrics. And the customers also mostly agree that the climate change and weather extremes are key sources of resilience hazards that needs to be considered at the state planning level. So as a part of the California's ongoing climate adaptation efforts, utilities are tasked to engage with local communities and conduct vulnerability assessments. So through these efforts, the stakeholders are now learning more on climate risks and vulnerabilities. And there are also other collaborations outside of these efforts. For example, SC and Sandia recently kicked off a pilot project to improve equity considerations in grid planning. And I believe they have an upcoming workshop at the end of this month. So overall, these efforts are extremely helpful to characterize the vulnerability profiles, which is a key input to resilience evaluation. But what we also need is a better understanding of the ultimate impacts on customer outages. And we need that to be able to compare different resources, the different solutions, wires, non-wires, and evaluate risk and economic trade-offs in between. Next slide, please. So within the IRP process, LSC's IRP filings can provide or could provide a venue for LSCs to share their findings on local resilience risks and mitigation plans. If they follow if they reach out to the local communities and kind of follow a process that Mariko was describing. As Sarah explained earlier, a key document that the LSCs submit to the CPUC is the narrative template, where LSCs describe their potential approach, planning approach, the analytical work, and their action plans. So this narrative could potentially be expanded for the LSCs to also demonstrate how their plans will improve resilience in local communities within their jurisdictions, and discuss their engagements with the local authorities and what they learned, and show findings of their resilience impact analysis. Another key document LSCs file is the resource data template. It includes information about LSC's existing and planned resources over the next 10 years. So this data file could potentially include a list of resources that are planned for resilience as well, and also their attributes. Here, a key piece of additional information would be the availability profile of resilience energy resources, where LSCs could show how much each resource's capacity would be reserved for resilience versus offered to the grid. And that information would be a function of time as well. There will be a time profile on it. And with this information, CPUC could then re-optimize the resource portfolio, again, with the same objective, focusing on system reliability and GHG emission reduction targets, but considering the resilience energy resources capacity and availability towards providing grid services. And at the end, this could potentially reduce total investment and production costs to meet future reliability and GHG targets, and improve cost effectiveness of the resource portfolio being selected. Next slide, please. As Sarah described earlier, the current IRP process includes CPUC staff to combine LSC's plans and evaluate the aggregate portfolio overall against system needs to determine if there are any gaps for meeting reliability and GHG targets cost effectively. So this process could potentially be expanded to for the IRP to also conduct a resilience level, a system level resilience assessment of the aggregate portfolio based on some standard metrics to quantify local resilience impacts. So through the process, the IRP would connect local resilience needs and concerns and potentially refine the ER capacity and use case assumptions. And LSCs would better represent the local community needs in their planning process. And they could also get clear guidelines on contracting and operating parameters for resilience versus grid services, how they overlap versus not. So overall, this process would also facilitate more dialogue and information exchange across LSCs and other stakeholders on resilience needs, concerns, and priorities. Yeah, I think next, so I would like to, so we had a mid-session Q&A, but I think for the interest of time, let's just move the, have the Q&A for the entire section at the end of the presentation, I think.
Just wanted to check, Jeremy, do you still have a question? You've had your hand raised. I just wanted to see if that was a new question or was it residual? If it's residual, yeah, there you go. Okay, that's it.
Okay. So here we show a potential framework on how to integrate resilience into research planning for discussion purposes. And, we went over this before, so I won't get into any of the details. But what I want to reiterate here is that the need for a comprehensive resilience assessment, which taps into several related but currently disconnected efforts. A process and an evaluation that incorporates a resilience definition, framework, metrics, and tools that are consistent with this CPUC resilience and microgrid efforts. A process bringing in information on vulnerability profiles from various utility-led efforts, such as CAVA, RAMP, or wildfire mitigation plans. Utilizing the latest climate projections to better reflect climate change impacts on demand forecasts and supply inputs. And at the end, take the resource portfolios identified in grid planning studies and evaluate the resilience of those portfolios. So the outputs would include a set of resilience metrics consistent with the CPUC's four-pillar methodology. And as Marco said, described earlier, so that could include variations of loss of load metrics, but not just for the system as a whole, but also showing the details with more locational granularity by type of customers affected, underlying hazards, and grid failure modes. And to inform the grid investment decisions, these outputs would need to flow back to the grid planning studies. And they can also be used to inform certain DER policies and program design, where the value of resilience is an important consideration. Next slide. So This is the same flow chart Marco described earlier, showing key elements of resilience evaluation model that we're working on. So here I want to highlight weather as an essential input into the model, not only into our model, but also to various planning efforts, as it can affect electric demand forecast, resource availability, bulk grid, and distribution systems, all parts of the grid. And with climate change, it's becoming increasingly challenging to characterize weather patterns, especially the extreme events driving capacity needs. So next, we'll discuss some of our recent work under the EPIC on the work the resilience effort, where we've been collaborating with the CEC staff and other stakeholders to incorporate the effects of climate change into demand forecasting. So here, the key motivation is that historical weather data is no longer sufficient for grid planning. The recent heat waves in California highlighted the importance of extreme weather and how it's characterized in grid planning studies. A big challenge is that the extreme weather events that drive capacity needs tend to be much more volatile and can vary significantly for from one year to another. So you can see that in the chart here, which shows the distribution of daily maximum temperatures over at CAISO over the past 30 years. So here the gray box shows the middle 90% of summer days, and the top of the red bar shows hottest summer day of the year, and then the bottom of the blue bar shows the coldest summer day in terms of the daily maximum temperatures. So here, if you just kind of zoom into last year's hottest temperature, it was nearly 10 degrees higher than the year before, the hottest temperature of the year before. But if you just compare the difference in average daily temperatures, that difference was less than a couple degrees. And on the right, you see the distribution of the hottest summer temperatures over the 30-year historical period. And here you can kind of see, if you really zoom in, that most of the historical data is clustered around 100 degrees. But we've had some extreme years where the temperatures were 5 to 10 degrees above that level. And many of these extremes were seen in recent years, 2017, August 2020, and September of last year. So looking at historical records alone, it's not really possible to tell if such events will be rare per history or if they'll become the new norm. So here the good news is that we now have access to highly granular climate projections for California that utilizes latest climate science to support various climate-related efforts in the state. So I'll turn that over to Mariko to describe some of these efforts.
Thanks, Onur. This graphic on the left, I'm sure looks familiar to some of you. It's the key takeaway of the IPCC's latest outlook on what might happen to global temperatures through the end of the century under different climate scenarios, or SSPs. Their report was published pretty recently, and it's supported by a suite of global climate models, or GCMs. And together, this coordinated set of models is referred to as the CMIP-6 projections. CMIP-6 produced rich information, but at the global scale. And the CEC, along with UCLA, Scripps Institute of Oceanography, UC Berkeley, and many others, they've played a critical role in taking these projections to a finer granularity needed for California energy system planning. Some of that is demonstrated on the right. Part of the downscaling is bringing the climate projections down from a 45-kilometer granularity to 9 and 3 kilometer granularities. And there's a whole suite of models needed to do that. These downscaled projections are then informing a variety of planning, adaptation, and mitigation efforts in the state. So there are several complementary efforts to incorporate climate change into the grid planning in California, including ongoing EPIC-funded research led by the CEC to integrate these downscaled climate projections into the state's demand forecasting and resource planning models, including us, Work to Resilience, and evaluating long-term reliability and resilience of planned resource portfolios. The CPUC has developed an approach to adjust historical weather inputs used in IRP modeling based on estimated differences from the ensemble of raw CMIP6 data. So that, I believe, has been presented through the CAVA proceeding and or possibly the IRP proceeding. And then the CPUC and stakeholders are also exploring a framework called the Global Warming Level Framework. That's within the CAVA or Climate Adaptation Proceeding to utilize projections from various climate models, assuming a certain warming level. And then these data are flowing through to many other types of vulnerability assessments and planning efforts across the state, just to name two, the utilities wildfire mitigation plans and California's 5th climate change assessment. Owner, back to you.
Thanks, Monica. So in our work with the CEC, we've focused on integrating the latest high-resolution climate projections developed in California, rather than the raw global model outputs. And this distinction is important because the anticipated climate change effects are not uniform geographically, and we need high-resolution climate data to capture the variations by location. So we provide a brief overview today, but for those who are interested, we have more details in a recent hyper workshop presentation that Mariko and I did a while ago back in August. I'll add the link to the CEC website for those materials. But when we look at the climate projections, we see, just like in historical data, we see a high year-to-year variability due to the uncertainty of weather patterns. And that's normal. There's nothing wrong about it. We see it historically as well. But what that means is in a demand forecast for a given future year, say 2030, we cannot simply plug in the climate projections for that year, because there would be a large uncertainty band around what could happen in that year. So we need a large ensemble of weather variants to develop normalized inputs and characterize the potential range of outcomes in a given future years, including the years with extreme events. So to increase the ensemble size, we developed a methodology to draw from a rolling window of up to 50 years around each forecast year, and then detrend that data to better reflect expectations of the forecast year. For example, if a demand forecast for 2023 would use climate simulations for 1998 through 2048, but then given the climate trends, the simulated temperatures in 2048 would be too warm for 2023. So the trending brings the simulated temperature levels back to what could be expected for 2023 by removing long-term trends from those simulations. But what it does is it leaves the effects of short-term variability of weather events, which is really important to, for capacity planning and resource planning. And so overall, the temperature trends due to climate change vary by location and by temperature levels. So for example, the trends in coastal areas could be very different than inland, or trends in high temperatures could be different than trends in low temperature levels. So to account for that, we detrend each temperature level, and quantile to each weather station separately, so to preserve that granularity. And this slide shows an example of how we do that. So on the chart, you see various annual temperature statistics, the min, max, median, in the top and bottom 5% of the hourly temperature levels in each year from one climate simulation in a given weather station. And the dashed lines shows the long-term trend line over the entire horizon through the end of the century. And here the box highlights the rolling period we would use to develop the ensemble of weather variants for 2023. And then the next slide, so if you go to the next slide, so this shows the same data set after each temperature level is detrended. So you can kind of see the dashed lines are flat here. And then we zoom into that period to develop the variance around the expectations for 2023 levels. And the actual calculations utilize more granular temperature bins and temperature levels than shown in here. But one thing I want to highlight is that that's really crucial, is that the end of the process, the hourly detail and the chronological order is maintained, which is really important to preserve various important correlations over time and the correlations between different weather variables. So if a given day is hot, the next day might be more likely to be hot than cold. And those kind of relationships are really important as a part of the weather inputs that flow into the planning models. And then just the last slide on this topic. So here we show one example, projected cooling and heating degree days, the CDDs and HDDs, based on the climate models, and we benchmark against historical observations. So CDDs and HDDs are key inputs to electricity consumption forecasts. They indicate how cold or warm outdoor temperatures are relative to a standard temperature, a threshold at which heating and cooling needs might be minimal, like typically set to 65 degrees. And here the charts show that CDDs are trending up and HDDs are trending down historically. So that's shown as black circles. So the current process using the historical data without accounting for such trends due to climate change would lead to bias in cooling and heating related consumption levels. And this is important because at the end, it might understate the future clean energy needs to meet GHG targets. So the trended temperature library developed using the approach that I described earlier provides a range of outcomes shown in gray here. And for benchmarking, we apply the same methodology to the historical period all the way back to 2006. And we found that the results are consistent, not only for historical trends and the variability, but also looking forward, we see the continued trends based on the latest climate projections, with CDDs rising and HDDs falling by 20 to 25% on average between today and 2050. And just another thing that I want to add is not included here, but we have similar analysis using the hourly data showing rising daily high temperatures during summer, which would have implications and it would impact the peak demand forecast and the future capacity needs. So yeah, with that, I'll pause and I don't know if you have time for Q&A or yeah, I think we should.
Thank you, Owner. So our last two slides include a tentative schedule for our study and some information about how to get in touch with us or follow our study. We have a post-workshop survey. If you're so inclined, please fill that out and let us know what you think. But we're short on time, so if you had any remaining questions, please feel free to email us directly. I'm Mariko at lumenenergystrategy.com, and Owner is owner@lumenenergystrategy.com, and Roseanne and Julian will give you their contact info. But I just wanted to say a really big thank you to our hosts from the CPUC, Roseanne and Julian, Jason, Commissioner Sharoma, and all the others who enabled this. We've really enjoyed this presentation and our prior ones and all of the rich discussion. So I'll turn it over to you, and thanks again to everyone who joined today.
Thank you so much, Marco and Owner. I really appreciate your presentation. Thank you, Sarah, for coming online and giving us the background to all of this with the IRP process. This being our pro-pre-ante penultimate slide, fifth from the end. We unfortunately don't have Commissioner Sharoma on the line for closing remarks, so we'll move to letting you know what our next workshop and last for this year is. We have join us on the November 28th, the week right after Thanksgiving break, for a presentation describing the results of the RenCat Social Burden Index project piloted through a partnership between Southern California Edison and Sandia National Laboratory. And then I also wanted to raise awareness, if you go to the next slide, that the CPUC has just issued a request for proposal for a consultant to help us advance equitable, resilient electric grid modernization and increased community engagement in resiliency planning by applying data-driven tools and developing a geospatial, equitable resilience evaluation model. Responses are due Tuesday, January 16th. Please contact us at the CPUC for more information. Next slide is our contact information. Thank you again for everyone who's joined us, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.